Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition and another week of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more from across every side of every political aisle, from across our divided country and our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. I hope you are having a good morning indeed. Let's get into the headlines here. In COVID news, first up, at least 444 new coronavirus deaths and 34,217 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 54,404 cases per day. That is a decrease of 7% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 29,842,900 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus. Almost 542,000 have died from it. We will have passed the 30 million total infections mark by the end of the week-ish, is my guess. We'll see. But that would certainly fit the way the numbers are trending. In national political news, on Monday, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform is holding a hearing on a bill to establish D.C. as the nation's 51st state. In January, Eleanor Holmes Norton reintroduced H.R. 51, which would create the state of Washington Douglas Commonwealth, named for Frederick Douglass, instead of named District of Columbia, of course. The measure would give D.C. 2 U.S. senators and a voting representative in the House. Statehood faces opposition by Republicans who argue it is an attempt by Democrats to shore up their majorities by adding more seats in Congress. I'm sure that it would is the thing, although to dismiss it as merely an attempt to do that just seems like a way to dismiss it. But Jamarl, you're living a little bit closer to D.C. than I am right now. And you grew up in Richmond, Virginia, not too far away. I can imagine you might have opinions about this. What's your take?
It is a way for them to beef up their representation. By the same token, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not representation. Meaning, it's irrelevant whether or not, let's say it this way, it should be irrelevant, completely irrelevant, whether or not it beefs up Democrats' representation. The only operative question is whether or not it's necessary for the representation of the people who are in D.C. That's all that matters. Meaning, for you to say that, hey, you're trying to just increase your numbers, that doesn't really matter. You're trying to keep those numbers down just so you can deny those people representation. Which one matters more? You know what I mean? Like, what's more important? Having those people to get some level of fair and earnest representation in a government that we consider to be a representative government, or allowing and helping the Republicans to keep things the way they are in Congress? I'm telling you, the latter is the one that doesn't matter. The former is the one that matters. So if you come to a determination that those people should be represented, the makeup of Congress is irrelevant to that. At least it should be. And the fact that Republicans are bringing it up as a point is funny, but one of the least relevant things in the world. So that's my thought.
I hear you. No, I hear you on that one. Yeah, fundamentally that shouldn't be the question. Although for those listening, it is clear DC is like as blue as the deepest part of the ocean, something like that. Although it is, although the deepest part of the ocean is increasingly filled with plastic, which is not exactly blue. But it is very deep blue. That's one way to put it. Anyway, back to the headlines. The White House announced its support earlier Wednesday for reauthorizing VAWA, V-A-W-A, that's the Violence Against Women Act, which aims to reduce domestic and sexual violence and improve the response to it through a variety of grant programs. The latest version of the act would establish a new grant program designed to help members of the LGBTQ plus community. The other measure the House took up Wednesday would remove the deadline for states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, in another attempt to eliminate a deadline passed in 1982 that has prevented the Equal Rights Amendment from becoming part of the Constitution. 9 senators on Saturday sent a letter to the Biden administration condemning his handling of the influx of migrants coming to the U.S.-Mexico border and calling for more quote-unquote clarity The senators added that, quote, Congress and the American people must have additional clarity about how DHS and HHS are addressing, end quote, the situation at the border. Republicans have argued that Biden's immediate rollback of Trump-era policies created the current influx of migrants at the border. The 9 senators are asking for more information from DHS and HHS, including a breakdown of the number of migrants detained since January 20th, the number of migrants tested and vaccinated for COVID-19, estimates for how much time individuals spent in CBP custody before and after testing, and future border apprehension projections. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on Sunday urged migrants not to travel to the United States, stating, quote, we are encouraging children not to come. Now is not the time to come. Do not come. There are not many ways you can say that. The journey is dangerous. We are building safe, orderly, and humane ways to address the needs of vulnerable children. Do not come, end quote. That's a little bit of a turnoff. He's basically saying, do not come. I think the message is do not come to the United States, which sounds a lot like Trump, to be honest. But hey, it's under Biden. One thing I've seen here, Jamarl, and I want to get your take on this. I've seen a variety of people, mostly on Twitter, admittedly, criticizing the media for covering this so much, and they all seem to be on like the liberal left, on the Democratic side of the left or whatever, are all like, the pandemic is raging. Why are you guys giving the migrant issue so much footing in your newspaper coverage? Why are you giving it so much coverage? Wasn't that like the primary focus for years during the Trump administration, other than Russiagate, I guess? But wasn't that like their big thing? Isn't it just now that it's Biden that they think it's ridiculous to cover it so much? Doesn't that seem self-serving?
I hate that you keep calling that the left. I hate that you keep calling it the left. Because the people on the left also pay attention to this. And they're also pointing out, hey, you guys, for example, have I ignored the border? No. Have I paid attention to it? Yes. I've even done monologues on it, making the point about, at least I think I've done monologues on it, making the point that you guys put out a welcome mat after attacking Trump for all of those years, and now you're shocked at all the people at the border. Biden has been lying flagrantly about the border. Look, what it boils down to is that you have this situation where Trump leaves, coronavirus goes down, and Biden changes his policy that allows children, unaccompanied, to be accepted into the country. Telling them to not come to the country, especially if their countries are on fire, or basket cases, or whatever else, it's not going to work. Joe Biden is never going to create a situation at the border that is worse than the countries to which we've instigated ourselves, either in the drug war or in general in these coups when we didn't particularly like random governments. So yeah, I don't think that's the left thing. I think that's Democrats' thing. It always bothers me.
In my defense, no, I hear you. I did say the liberal left. I think I was
fair enough.
A little bit cagey about how I used it. But you know what I mean.
Fair enough. Look, with Trump, that's the only thing they cared about. The Trump and the border. Yes. Look at the cages. Look at the cages. AOC goes down and breaks down that the border, starts crying. Oh my God, the border. And now all of a sudden, it's shameless. It's something that they're not supposed to do. Oh, Republicans are horrible for focusing on the border. Why is the media talking about the border? Yeah, shameless hypocrisy. Agree.
It's pretty interesting stuff. Anyway, let's get back to the headlines here. Mayoral candidate Andrew Yang found himself on the end of a hate and love reaction, a love and hate reaction at a Stop Asian Hate rally in Chinatown Sunday when he called for more funding for the NYPD's Asian Hate Crimes Task Force. He told the crowd, quote, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to fully fund the Asian Hate Crimes Task Force, end quote. His statement was initially met with applause, but others in the crowd then booed and chanted, defund the police. Hearing the crowd's reaction, Yang surprisingly doubled down, stating, quote, I know that there are people that are very passionate about this, but the fact is, when someone gets stabbed, you need the police to follow up, end quote. Later, Yang can be seen moving through the crowd while young activists follow him, continuing their defund chant from earlier. Sunday's rally was held in response to last Tuesday's massacre in Atlanta of 8 people, including 6 Asian women. Federal and local law enforcement investigators have yet to find concrete evidence that would be enough to build a federal hate crime case against the man accused of killing 8 people at 3 Atlanta area spas. The suspect was charged Wednesday with 8 counts of murder. 6 of the victims were women of Asian descent. After probing electronic devices and conducting interviews, investigators have seen no evidence leading in the direction of a hate crime. The suspect allegedly told investigators that he had a sexual addiction and saw the businesses that he targeted as a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate. end quote. In international news, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin arrived in New Delhi for a 3-day visit on Friday, during which he had held talks with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, and Foreign Minister Subramanian Jaishankar. Lloyd's surprise trip comes amid Washington's review of the Doha Agreement with the Taliban, as the promised deadline for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan is drawing closer. The Taliban movement urged the U.S. to complete the pullout of its troops from Afghanistan by May 1st, as agreed last year. Biden said that the final decision on the pullout of troops was yet to be made, and Washington was consulting with its allies on the matter. In Myanmar last week, it was announced that the military had issued arrest warrants for 11 staff members of George Soros' Open Society Foundation Myanmar, OSF Myanmar, including its head and deputy head, on suspicion of giving financial support to the civil disobedience movement against the military junta. The military also seized control of the bank accounts of OSF in Myanmar, amounting to about $3.81 million American, and announced that it will take legal action against the foundation, against $3,810,000 to be clear. That's a slightly confusing phrasing on my part. Anyway, the coup government has accused OSF Myanmar of violating multiple financial restrictions on the activities of organizations interfering on domestic affairs. And of course, this is most interesting because it's George Soros, which is the boogeyman of many on the right, but also increasingly some on the left, too. The Republic of Congo's top presidential opposition candidate, Guy Brice Parfait Kolelis, has died. Kolelis was last seen in a video circulating Saturday on social media in which he told supporters he was fighting death. In his recent days, he had been particularly critical of the reigning leader Sassou Nguesso, declaring that the Republic of Congo had become a police state. Sassou Nguesso is the third longest-serving president in Africa. Voting in the Republic of Congo's election took place Sunday, and results are expected this week. Meanwhile, in Tanzania, the president John Magufuli, known as the Bulldozer, has died at a hospital in Dar es Salaam. The country's vice president announced that in a television address on Wednesday. Magufuli was one of Africa's most prominent COVID skeptics. He claimed his country had eradicated coronavirus by the grace of God, questioned the safety of foreign COVID-19 vaccines, and made no plan to procure any shots for his country, instead pushing for the use of herbal medicine and steam treatments. Tanzania hasn't reported COVID-19 figures since April 2020. Samia Suluhu Hassan is now the acting president of Tanzania. She was sworn in on Friday as Tanzania's first female president. And the value of the Turkish lira dropped sharply today. This comes 2 days after Turkey's President Erdogan fired the head of the country's central bank. That's the third time he's fired the head of that organization in 3 years. So a lot recently, just put it like that. In tech news, Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system has successfully completed a third series of experiments. That's according to Israel's Minister of Defense on Tuesday. The system successfully intercepted and destroyed targets, simulating existing and emerging threats, including drones, rockets, and missiles. The Israeli Defense Ministry has sought U.S. funding and expertise for its air and missile defense lasers. The newly configured Iron Dome system, made by Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, will be absorbed by the Air Force and will strengthen the multi-layer defense system against missiles, reportedly. And Tesla CEO Elon Musk has responded to criticism of his huge wealth by Senator Bernie Sanders, saying he would use his money to help humankind. Sanders is on record criticizing Musk, stating, quote, "We are in a moment in American history where two guys, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, own more wealth than the bottom 40% of people in this country," end quote. And that, quote, "that level of greed and inequality is not only immoral, it is unsustainable," end quote. In response, Musk said he was, quote, "accumulating resources to help make life multiplanetary," end quote. Musk, who also runs SpaceX, said last year that he planned to send 1 million people to Mars by 2050, creating a lot of jobs on the red planet. Now, Jamarl, I've got to go to you for this one. There are technically more headlines, but realistically, that's about all the time we have. But it's Elon Musk and Bernie Sanders going toe-to-toe over wealth and interplanetary travel. It's like a couple of your things brought together. I've just got to go to you. What's your take?
I think it's always amazing that people with zero survival concerns often talk about love and light and reaching out past Earth. That's what I think. I think Elon Musk should not be a billionaire. I think Elon Musk and his wealth should be given to the people of the world. He has enough wealth basically to get rid of poverty. And then we can have this conversation about love and light and reaching out and living on Mars. Up until that point, no. Meaning, it is easy for somebody with zero survival concerns to be like, hey, I want to go out into the cosmos. That's great. You have a planet here with people who are just like you, where the 30%, if I'm not mistaken, live off $2 a day. And I think 60% live off $10 a day. Have that conversation about living elsewhere at the point where we deal with our issues here on Earth. Until then, no. Elon Musk needs to stay where he is and deal with the hellishness of this planet with the rest of us. That's where I'm at. I'm with Sanders on this.
See, oh man, well, this would become a longer conversation. I'll briefly throw in like my half a penny's worth of consideration here, which is, I also am worried about like an asteroid hitting the planet or some other existential catastrophe hitting us. I like the idea of humanity being multiplanetary. Having said that, if we become so, and I'm still somehow alive, I would really rather stay on Earth. I don't have personally that much interest in like moving to another planet, and I really want to support like ecological restoration at the deepest level. I guess one of the things is, additionally to the idea that you can have like an escape hatch that humanity as a whole can access to save itself in case crap really starts to hit the fan here. I also think there's something a little bit more optimism causing about having a higher purpose that we can rally around. The idea that like if we're pushing out to the stars and we're doing it together and we're doing it in a better way, I could see that bringing people together to the extent, you know, you might get nations around the world to rally together instead of rallying against each other with more and more wars. But I know there's a bunch you would disagree with there and you'd push back on. We're out of time right now, though. Got to come back to this at some later time throughout today's show. You're listening to Headlines. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute on the other side of this break with our soapbox segment, Jamarl's monologue, and more. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. You know, one of the benefits of getting old is that you remember things that happened prior. For whatever particular reason, our memory don't go necessarily into the future. And so we are stuck basically with having the luxury of remembering things that happened into the past. That said, whatever we lose from our physical faculties, our ability to dunk a basketball or run faster than somebody else, it is a power that you gain in remembering that stuff. I remember that despite the fact that George Bush lied this country into a war, despite it cost, 4,000 American lives, despite it being up to, $8 trillion, if not more at this point, despite it costing 1 million Iraqis, however you can even quantify that. I don't even know if we could process what that looks like. Despite it caused fires in other countries, meaning it set the pretext for the wars in Libya and Syria. And think about the number of people that died in those wars. More importantly, even if you can't process the number of people that died in those wars, that were maimed, or the people that lost their loved ones, their homes, their businesses, the people that fled and ended up fleeing into Europe, which basically destabilized that country or those countries in Europe. Think of all of the calamity that was caused by George Bush using 9/11, lying about 9/11, and dragging this country into a war. More importantly, about the number of people, or just as importantly, the laws that was broken to do that, the torture that George Bush bragged about that nobody seemed to care about. Like I said, the million Iraqis that died that nobody apparently seems to care about. An international criminal court that doesn't seem to even be able to do a job on that front. The other countries around the globe that basically gave all of that death and murder and mayhem a pass. And even the media in the United States that's supposed to have the dog being the watchdog gives it a pass. It's utterly astonishing. George Bush is being rehabilitated right now. And instead of the media being more adversarial, being more antagonistic, pointing to this thing as a crime that deserved to be prosecuted, we don't get that. We get silence. We get talks about how China is holding a genocide. We get talks about how God-man Putin is basically running the world. And we get talks about everybody else, with the exception of the things that are taking place here. This was a massive crime. And this massive crime is almost codified by not having consequences. Not just not having consequences, we even have jokes. George Bush, the person who lied about it, the person who broke out laws by pushing torture, the person who broke out laws by mass surveillance. Again, none of these things were prosecuted. That guy, on top of killing all of those people, jokes about the killing of all those people. Let's play the clip. This is not even the worst of it, but let's play the clip.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.
500,000 people died. Put that in perspective. What does that look like? Honestly, I'm regarding you. What does that look like? I don't even think that's in question. If you are even making the point about the number of people that have died, even before that war, Bill Clinton killed 500,000 kids with the sanctions. And Madeleine Albright asked, she said, I think it was necessary. It was so necessary, in fact, that it didn't do what they wanted it to do. Otherwise, they wouldn't have went into the country to kill 1 million people, where George Bush could sit here and laugh with the press laughing with him about the killing of those 1 million people. That's profound. I don't think you need to put that in perspective. What if Putin did that? What if Putin engaged in a war, then turned around and laughed at hundreds of thousands of people dying as a result? That's astonishing. That's utterly astonishing. And the media is right there laughing with them. Because for whatever particular reason, our killers and the people who we kill is not as a big deal as theirs. That's the honest to God truth of it. George Bush can be rehabilitated now because the actions that he took in that office is somehow separate and distinct from the character of George Bush. I don't know how they do that. That's only true for Americans. We are exceptional after all. That's not true for other leaders around the world. They are utterly and indelibly stained by whatever they do or takes place when they're in that office, but not our leaders. They float above it all. Nancy Pelosi even makes the point that she knew George Bush was lying about the weapons of mass destruction. Let's hear this. I want to put this in context. Because George Bush killed 500,000 people on a low end. Nancy Pelosi, who basically realizes that the President of the United States is taking our military, our young men and women who put on the uniform, into a country based on a lie. She knew it, at least based on what she said. Let's play the clip.
When I became Speaker the first time, there was overwhelming call for me to impeach President Bush on the strength of the war in Iraq, which I vehemently opposed. And again, I said at other places, that was my wheelhouse. I was intelligence. I was the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, even before I became part of the leadership of Gang of Four. So I knew there were no nuclear weapons in Iraq. It just wasn't there. They had to show us, they had to show the Gang of Four all the intelligence they had. The intelligence did not show that that was the case. So I knew it was a misrepresentation to the public. But having said that, It was in my view, not
Let's
a ground.
stop right there for the moment.
That was.
I knew he was lying. I knew he was lying. There is nothing that a president can do of larger consequence than war. It destabilizes our own nation, depending upon the significance of the war, and it kills, maims, and murders others. If you want to know whether there are going to be war crimes committed into a war, the answer is always going to be yes. There's inevitably going to be war crimes because of the situation to which you put. But even beyond the war crimes, beyond what we're calling a crime, the very act of taking our military and smashing another country, killing other human beings over something that Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, said she knew was a lie. And she couldn't even be bothered to impeach the president for lying this country into a war. As if the people who he killed and extinguished didn't matter. They were mothers, they were fathers, they were grandparents. They had wants and likes. They had dogs. They had things that they know and loved and cared about, aspirations. And even though you may not have necessarily liked their country or the leader of their country, does that mean that they needed to be extinguished and wiped off the face of the earth? And then co-signed with a speaker who said, yeah, I knew they were lying about it, but it didn't rise to the level of impeachment when he killed 500,000 people and spent $7 trillion to do it. Trump, however, he does. That was her point there. Joe, I knew he was lying about the nukes. However, that didn't rise to the level of impeachment. Donald Trump, that SOB, absolutely. Isn't that astonishing? 18 years, no consequences. We don't even talk about it honestly with the gravity that 500,000 people being eliminated off the face of the earth as a result of our actions. We don't even talk about it honestly. We act like it didn't even happen. And I even heard some people making the argument at one point, those Iraqis need to get over it. They need to get over it. Yeah, we need to think about this. Psaki one time said, well, Americans learn from their actions. It doesn't seem like it. We don't learn from it. We continue to do it. And I make the point that we continue to do it because we never accept it as being wrong. As long as it's somebody else, country, we're perfectly fine with it. Our leaders aren't killers, regardless of the actions that they take and regardless of the number of people they kill, maim, and murder in foreseeable wars that they take on. Somehow, they are separate and distinct from the actions that they take and the consequences of those actions. I think that's ludicrous. In real world terms, we are responsible for the actions that have taken place in Iraq. And right now, we're there in a country that utterly despises us. And we're still there. George Bush has been rehabilitated because they hate Donald Trump so much. At some point, honesty needs to be seen somewhere. And I would just make the point that the media and the way they deal with this in this country shows your problem on some level. Shane, I'm going to bring you in. What does this show about media? If we look at a situation like this and we acknowledge this looks bad, all of these people died. Let's say the media says, well, wait a minute, Jamarl, it wasn't 500,000, it was 100,000. Okay, whatever. It was more than that, but let's say it was 100,000. How do you justify that? How do you justify it as a country? How do you justify it laughing at it as media? How do you justify that having consequences to any of the people that were in office? How does you justify from the standpoint of Nancy Pelosi saying that all of those people dying, all of that money spent doesn't rise to the level of impeachment, but Trump does? This makes no sense to me, Shane. Put it in perspective. Frame it for me.
You don't need to justify it if you don't ever talk about it. And that's what the media effectively is paid to do. The media are like courtiers in the old king's court. They hang around. They try to buy their way into greater graces with the powers that be, because of course that gives them access. And the way that they do that most of the time is by giving power what it wants, by giving the president, in this case, the administration, the intelligence community, et cetera, broadly painting things in their perspective, occasionally getting hits in, if there's a story big enough that they can buy off some audience and not burn too many bridges. But for the most part, what they want is more access and more funding. And that's true whether you're talking about your average reporter or the editor or the owners of media publications and the owners of the TV news media. And you know what I'm talking about. So we don't ever need to come to terms with what we've done if we're just not reminded of it too often. Now, Where I would take this, and then of course we have to close. You're talking about the past year, you're talking about the Iraq War, but just think that whether it's Russiagate, whether it's accusing China of genocide, these are the kinds of things they've done to justify war in the past. There is no sign that they've stopped that kind of thought process, that they've stopped that kind of behavior. You know that they haven't. And the question I wonder is, how much of this bellicosity, how much of this, almost wartime rhetoric that we're seeing, with Trump saying that, with Biden saying that Putin has no soul, that he's a killer, all this stuff, those recent comments, all of it, how much of it can we really believe? How much of it is just a put on to get what they want in terms of their foreign policy goals? I think the vast majority of it, which is a shame if you think about it, because how many, you're talking about a million lives lost, a handful of millions of lives lost in these wars. How many tens or hundreds of millions of lives could be lost if we got into a world war? Now, I think rightly a lot of the parties here are afraid of that, but there are enough people who are ignoring their fear that I'm a little bit afraid at this point. We need to go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break in a short minute with Alexander Mercouris talking about EU vaccine rollout. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about the EU and vaccines, the European Union, which has for a long time now, many months, had problems with not just procuring, but deploying vaccines. Most recently, this comes up with the AstraZeneca crisis, where as part of the battle between the EU and the UK over Brexit, AstraZeneca, the vaccine developed by Oxford along with a German company, EU is having problems getting this thing out. First, they were having problems getting it from the UK, and now they're having problems from their own citizenry, as many worry that there are links between the vaccine and numerous health conditions, including blood clots, most notably, with a wave of countries first starting to question whether AstraZeneca was linked to blood clots, temporarily revoking its use, then some of those countries walking that back. We're also going to be talking in this segment, I'm going to bring our guest in, about the Sputnik V vaccine, and the question of whether or when the EU would consider working with Russia on this. And again, if they were to do so, that would be a very interesting sort of geopolitical move on their part, even though first and foremost, it's a public health policy matter. But if they choose to do that, where does that leave their balance of interests with Russia? How would that affect the United States' perceptions of the EU? And of course, most importantly, how would that affect the EU's perspectives of Russia? How would that change the potential for long-term serious conflict? For this conversation, we are joined by Alexander Mercouris. For those listening, Alexander Mercouris is editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can follow his work with the Duran on YouTube and on their website, theduran.com. Alexander, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm very well, and my pleasure, my great pleasure to be on your show again.
It is our great pleasure to have you. Thank you again for joining us. Let's get straight into the conversation, and I suppose we should start with the Sputnik V vaccine. We can come back to the wider AstraZeneca rollout, where that is, what sense you get in Britain, where, of course, the AstraZeneca vaccine has been deployed widely and, to what I can tell, a great degree of success. But I want to hear your take on that. With Sputnik V, though, what has held this off for so long? And if the EU decides to go through with it, how do you think that'll change things? How do you think that might affect public perceptions in many European Union member countries of Russia, of the Russian Federation? Alexander.
Right. Well, Sputnik V is not an issue in Britain. The British have been busy inoculating people mainly with the AstraZeneca vaccine, also to some extent with the Pfizer vaccine. I would, by the way, hesitate to say that the British vaccination program is quite as successful as people have been saying, because what the British have been doing is that they've been committing all the doses they have to giving as many people as they can the first dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine and the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine without storing large amounts of vaccine to cover the second dose. So we have 20 times, or as some people say, 30 times more people who've been vaccinated with the first dose than the second. And we are now running out of vaccine. We're running out of AstraZeneca. And that may mean that the whole British vaccination program goes off course, off-piste, within a few weeks. So it's not quite as good as people think it is. That's the first thing. But in Britain, we're not talking about Sputnik V. In continental Europe, where they've had problems getting their vaccination program going at all, there is much more talk about Sputnik V. There is, however, a huge amount of political resistance to Sputnik V. There was a political crisis in Slovakia when the Slovak government, or some people within the Slovak government, wanted to buy it in. And there's been great resistance in most European countries to adopting it. Some political leaders, like Angela Merkel, seem open to the idea, but the European Medicines Agency, which is the EU's regulator, is dragging its feet on giving it approval. And there's talk that might not happen before the end of May. So it's politics are getting in the way of Sputnik V.
Oh, good sense, right? Alexander, real quick, I want to get into why. Because, like you said, it's politics. I want to play this clip by Jen Psaki. This is the White House press conference. She's talking about, basically, she's asked a question about the vaccine. Now, keep in mind, within the U.S. Health and Human Services report, it made the point that, bragged actually, that we were pushing countries like Brazil to not use Sputnik V's vaccine. And Jen was asked about this. Let's play this clip.
The president said yesterday that the U.S. is in talks with several countries about sharing vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, you criticized Russia and China for so-called vaccine diplomacy, and you suggested that it should be done through international project or institutions. So, do you exclude sharing vaccine on a bilateral basis?
I think our criticism was in response to questions about whether we were concerned about how vaccines were being used in some ways by Russia and China in ways that they've used aid and international assistance where there are no strings attached. And sometimes it allows countries to hold themselves to lower standards on
Let's
human
stop right
rights.
there for a second. I love that. I
freedom
love
of
that clip.
press, freedom.
The issue with Russia and China's vaccine is that they don't have strings attached. The beauty of ours is that we do. There are foreign policy considerations that we want. If your citizenry want to avoid death and disease and asphyxiation, isn't that extreme? Like, that's so astonishing to me. Brazil is one of the countries that was enumerated in their document. Brazil has nearly 300,000 deaths right now. They're on their way to apparently 500,000. And my question was, what about Europe? Brazil also turned down the Chinese vaccine. So if that diplomacy that she's talking about, no strings attached, that means that Europe is probably also being pushed. And some of the decisions that they're making is basically the U.S. saying, look, our foreign policy considerations need to matter more than the lives of your citizenry. How do they justify that? Because that's an extreme position to me.
It is extraordinary, extreme position. They don't justify it. They don't talk about it. The media, at least in Britain that I've seen, and you know, I follow the German media quite closely also, they haven't been talking about it either. This is what's so extraordinary about this whole debate. The entire discussion against the immorality of that whole approach to vaccines is entirely confined to independent media bodies like ours. We are not really in a situation where they try to justify that. But what it does show, because bear in mind, this is having a major impact. This pandemic is having a major impact on the world economy and is dragging the economies down and weakening them in the West primarily. They are prepared not only to see people die, but their overall economic position weaken because of this geopolitical obsession they have with Russia primarily, but with China to some extent also. It is a remarkable mindset, but it shows, I think, the extraordinary fanaticism of this outlook that we see in Washington, and not, by the way, just in Washington, but in other places. I think if Britain, for example, really does face a vaccine crisis in April, it will not buy Sputnik V, for the simple reason that doing so would be politically unacceptable to the political and leadership class. That option is not even being talked about here. And anybody who tries to suggest it will immediately be knocked down.
When you say the political and leadership class there, are you talking primarily about the inhabitants of the United States? Just
No.
Briefly, who are you talking about there?
Right. Partly the political leadership of the United States. I mean, but also its outliers and auxiliaries and vassals, if you like, around Europe and in other countries. Bear in mind, Brazil had an option to buy Sputnik V. It didn't do so because, of course, the United States lobbied against it buying Sputnik V. But there were obviously people in Brazil itself who were open to that kind of advice coming from the United States. Bolsonaro thinks of Brazil as an ally of the United States. And there are many people in Europe as well who think the same way. The British political class is viscerally anti-Russian to the same extent, perhaps to an even greater extent, that the American political class is. And there are also very strong anti-Russian people within the political classes across Europe, in France, in Germany, certainly in some of the East European states like Poland and the Baltic states, and they are a massive roadblock to accepting Sputnik V. And when they have the support of the United States behind them, that makes it extremely difficult for Sputnik V to penetrate into continental Europe. I suspect if we see shortages of vaccines still there and taking hold in the summer, we will start to see some cracking on the margins. I think Germany is probably more open to accepting Sputnik V than some other EU countries are. And given the weight Germany carries, others will follow. France, too, will probably go the same way as Germany, and Italy is already indicating that it will go there. But be very clear, if that happens, there will be a political push back from some people and something of a political and diplomatic crisis also. And the Americans and the British will be furious and will straightforwardly and openly condemn it.
Alexander, we only have a few minutes left on this side of the segment, and this is perhaps too broad a question, but I still will pose it to you anyway. We can maybe push it slightly, but regardless, I want your take. In terms of the balance of interests, the balance of considerations that would lead Europe towards or away from a relationship with Russia, what do you see on the table on either side? I'll give you a couple of initial examples. Just simply, obviously, based on the conversation we were just having, political and leadership classes in the United States and the United Kingdom, perhaps first and foremost, I also mentioned the Baltic states, but just take those two, have a history of bellicosity with, generations of conflict during the Cold War. And of course, those sentiments continue today. Those will definitely be in the sort of negative column towards a rapprochement between Europe and Russia, towards the European Union, between the European Union and Russia. On the other side of also a negative, Russia and the EU have opportunities to sort of winnow away states and territory from each other's diplomatic blocs, whether it's Ukraine or Belarus. two regions here that are sort of more or less contested right now by these two groupings. Those are both negatives, but it seems that there are also many positives that would lead the European Union, Europe as a whole, towards a greater degree of reconciliation and consolidation with Russia. Just in a minute here, what do you see as the main points in favor and points against, Alexander?
This is a huge topic, but briefly, I think that there was a shock in Europe after Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative, went to Moscow, and they found that the Russians were completely uncompromising. And I think the Europeans are in the process of readjusting their relations with Russia and are starting to say to themselves, at least this is the view in certain EU capitals, that we cannot allow a situation to arise where Russia completely drifts away from us. Because if that were to happen, Europe's position would be internationally so weakened and economically so weakened also. So I expect and anticipate that over the next few months, unless there is major obstruction from Washington, there will be an attempt by the Europeans to at least reopen dialogue with the Russians. There was a meeting with Ukraine, France, and Germany a few days ago, and the Ukrainians were wanting to take a very hard line against Russia, and the French and German representatives, on the contrary, made it very clear that they expect and demand that Ukraine will abide by its ceasefire obligations. So you see that I think that things at the moment are evenly balanced, but the big powers in the EU, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, want to see an end, at least to this particular period of confrontation with Russia. They want to start moving things back towards, if not friendship, which I think is now impossible, at least to some sort of constructive dialogue again. So, but we will see how that plays out. If the EU doesn't do that, then of course their big risk is that Russia, as it's now said it would do, will simply say we're no longer interested in relations with the EU anymore. We're forging ahead with our relations with China, and all our gas and oil will flow east, not west. All our trade will increasingly be with the East, not the West, and of course our military and our military diplomatic intelligence relationship with China will intensify even further. And that would, of course,
that would create a massive Eurasian power bloc that. And China, of course, the world's fastest growing nation, as far as I can tell, particularly on its scale, at least one of the parties in that power bloc, but arguably both of them, unarguably major superpowers in their own right. One of those parties, China, growing like gangbusters over decades. And so looking decades into the future, that would not be a favorable, political grouping for the West or for the European Union. We have to close it here. We're going to come back, continuing this conversation in a slightly different direction, but we're joined by Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can follow his work with The Duran on YouTube and on their website, theduran.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Alexander on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Continuing on the subject of Europe, or in the UK, some 21 million people in 16 areas of France, including the French capital, are being forced into a third lockdown. Let's call it a soft third lockdown, as 35,000 new infections were recorded on Friday. And this includes basically a number of intensive care cases that rival the second wave of the coronavirus as it was hitting France. This has basically caused a third lockdown. Now, under the new measures, non-essential businesses will be forced to close. Schools will remain open, along with hairdressers, if they follow, quote, a particularly sanitary protocol, unquote. People will be allowed to exercise outdoors within 10 kilometers or 6 miles of their home, and they are not allowed to travel to other parts of the country unless they have a valid reason. As you can imagine, this is probably not going to go well in France, the country that prides its liberty and its ability to protest. To have a conversation, and this conversation is going to expand beyond France for the moment into other countries like Germany, for example, that has larger or rising numbers. Poland, again, rising numbers. Alexander Mercouris. Again, Alexander, welcome to the show. Alexander is a editor-in-chief at theduran.com, and like I said, one of my favorite shows. So, Alexander, thank you for joining us.
Mm-hmm.
So, Alexander.
My pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. We were having this conversation in the first half about basically vaccine nationalism, if you want to call it that, and the issue with the vaccine taking place in the various places in Europe. With the numbers increasing in Germany, and for that matter, even in France, how is this being received by the local populations? Meaning, it's one thing to say that there's difficulties with the vaccines, and it's one thing to say that the rollouts were difficult and everything else. But like you said, this breeds political trouble and political difficulty as the populations rebel, not to mention the frustration associated with the numbers increasing and still being locked down. How are these governments, be it Germany or for this matter, France, especially France, because France has a certain character about it that I would imagine hates these lockdowns. What are your thoughts?
Well, can I first say, if you wanted to devise the worst possible policy on dealing with this problem, the Europeans have hit on it. I mean, they failed to organise sufficient supplies of vaccine. They went out of their way to trash the AstraZeneca vaccine in a way that is almost certain which has in fact increased vaccine skepticism, vaccine resistance across Europe. They're now desperately short in terms of their vaccine coverage across Europe. Cases are rising. New variants are rising.
Let me ask you this real quick, and I hate to interrupt. We have a perspective here that Europe is more competent on stuff like this. Now, I don't know if that's entirely just because, 500,000 people died under Trump or what it is. But, yeah, but why? How did they get this so wrong? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. I think it's because they centralized it. They tried to do it all from the EU, from the center in Brussels, because basically Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron insisted that it should be done from Brussels. And the bureaucracy in Brussels is simply not geared to executing that kind of plan. They are they are very good regulators, or at least regulation is something that they understand. Management and administration is not something they understand. And coordinating the health bureaucracies of 27 countries was simply far beyond what it was their competence to do. So it failed. But in light of that failure, what we have seen is a drift back towards lockdowns, because essentially that is the only game in town now, given the rising case counts. And you're absolutely right. There is going to be enormous resistance. And you mentioned France. But I was talking the other day to some people in Germany whom I know, and they told me that the mood in Germany has become extremely rebellious and antagonistic to lockdowns. And you're seeing more and more people, especially young people, by the way, openly rebelling against lockdowns. So we're finding ourselves in Europe in the worst possible situation, where people are becoming completely alienated from governments. They no longer trust what their governments are doing. The European Commission has spectacularly failed, and people are becoming resentful of lockdowns, whereas back in a year ago, they had supported them in the belief that the governments knew what they were doing. So we are in the worst possible situation we could be in Europe at the moment, in my opinion, where we have no real policies, no coherent policies going forward, and are drifting into a lockdown policies as a substitute for anything else.
And it's not a good look for any of us. That is far from the most important aspect. The most important aspect, I would argue, is people who have actually died from the virus, and then secondarily, the long run degradation of trust in governance as that governance shows itself to be untrustworthy in a lot of cases. But I guess third and kind of down in the pack, it does not look good in terms of historical self-reflection of the perspectives of other nations. Again, if you compare us with China for a moment, they nipped this in the bud. They effectively were able to control the spread from very early days. Where when you're looking at the United States, we were doing decent vaccine rollout at this point, but 500,000 dead and rising over 500,000 by quite a bit at this point. The UK, admittedly, their vaccine rollout has been going a bit better over the last couple of months. It's been they've been near the head of the pack. But I remember Boris Johnson flip-flopping all over the place on what the right strategy was, first focusing on herd immunity and then getting sick himself and quickly changing his tune. And of course, the European Union, which, as you just laid out, has demonstrably failed to deliver, whether on vaccines or on effective lockdown policy. And again, if you just compare China, bring China into the conversation for a moment, they have done a much more effective job at managing it, and their economy seems to be seeing the benefits of that. We only have a couple of minutes. I wanted to turn to Turkey, but any quick comment there, Alexander?
No, absolutely. And I mean, you can see the Chinese full of confidence. Can I just quickly, and very, very quickly, quote some words that I saw in a Global Times editorial? Global Times is the Chinese official government newspaper, which is published in English. And it says, the U.S.'s sense of crisis stems fundamentally from the decline of its comprehensive competitiveness. The most influential bilateral relationship in Eurasia is the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. To be honest, no country in the region can stand alone against either China or Russia, let alone fight against the two powers at the same time. It would be disastrous for any country which tends to confront China and Russia to forge an alliance with the U.S. So they're saying the U.S. is incompetent, is losing competitiveness. No country can stand up to us, either separately, that's to say Russia and China, and certainly not when we're acting together. And they shouldn't depend on the United States because the U.S. is failing. So that is the mood in Beijing as they see the situation now. It's exactly what you said.
And you can see that. I mean, let's close it here. We're going to turn to Turkey, but that was a great commentary, and I'm glad you brought that. And you can see that also in the talks in Alaska between Blinken and Chinese equivalents, effectively, where China is telling you are not in charge anymore. You can't come to us. I'm paraphrasing here, but you can't come to us and dictate the terms of our conversations, of the agreements that we make. You can't come to us with the soft power charm or force or threats anymore. It isn't going to work. We're out of time. Alexander, thank you for joining us. Great conversation.
My pleasure. My great pleasure.
For those listening, that was the voice of Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can follow his work with The Duran on YouTube and on their website, theduran.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're closing this hour out. We will be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning's show. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe, welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am the ever-vigilant, the indefatigable, the political analyst, for that matter, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, where your political compass spins aimlessly, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I apologize for the weirdness on that one. There is a proof of concept that is taking place. Now, the people who are listening to this show can't necessarily see it because, indeed, you are listening to this. And even if you're one of those people that can see sound, it still doesn't necessarily work because, you're not necessarily seeing the same thing that I am putting out for you to see. In this very specific case, we have the capability of pushing out an image now of both of us. And so you can see Shane on the side of some of these conversations now. And that is a positive. That's called progress. Let's get to the headlines.
It's live video.
Yeah.
We have live video, folks. We're
live video.
One step closer to television or something like that.
I know, right? I know. All right, so let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 444 new coronavirus deaths and 34,217 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 54,400 and 4,000 cases per day, a decrease of 7% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 29,842,900 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and almost 542,000 have died from it. To put this in perspective, they're trying to get across the situation in France. More than 35,000 new infections were reported in the past 24 hours in France, and that was Friday. And we have a situation in the United States where 34,000 new cases were reported in the United States. Now, put this in context. There are, 320 million people, give or take, depending upon who drops dead on a particular day in the United States. We are far larger, far larger than France. And yet, the number of infections are basically the same. Yeah, it's a big deal. And so when we're making this case of whoa, it's mind-blowing that these guys are turning down vaccines. It's not like that because a vaccine was produced, let's say if it was produced by Cuba, that somehow, because Cuba is on the U.S. naughty list, or because Russia is on the U.S. naughty list, or because China is on the U.S. naughty list, that somehow the medicine breaks down. That somehow the science is fundamentally different in a way that adversely affects the body of various people who are not Chinese or Russian or Cuban or whoever else. Nonsense. If your country is being besieged by a virus, and you are at the point, a leader of that country, and you decide that U.S. foreign policy concerns matter more than the life and limb of your countrymen, then yeah, your countrymen should be very upset. And yeah, I would totally understand a certain level of destabilization within the context where the countries of your people don't want to be stuck inside, and they know as a flat fact that you had the opportunity to get something that could have prevented that. Yeah, it's a big deal. And the number of people that France has infected is a big deal. I don't know what is going on with Europe. I thought Europe was a far more competent actor. Apparently not. On Monday, House Committee on Oversight and Reform is holding a hearing on a bill to establish D.C. as the nation's 51st state. In January, Eleanor Holmes Norton reintroduced H.R. 51, which would create the state of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth, named for Frederick Douglass. The measure would give D.C. 2 U.S. senators and a voting representative in the House statehood in the House. Statehood faces opposition by Republicans who argue it's an attempt by Democrats to shore up their majorities by adding 2 seats in Congress. Of all of the things that are significant about statehood, that's not one of them. Your country and the people of your country, you're supposed to live in a representative government. If indeed you live in a representative government, part of that is to be represented. For a Republican or for anybody to make an argument that the reason that they're against something is because Democrats may get an advantage, that's irrelevant. Will there be representation, and should the people of DC be represented? If that answer is either yes or no. Whether or not Democrats get an advantage, whether or not Republicans get an advantage, is secondary and not even part of the question. At the end of the day, if indeed we live in a representative government, DC should get their people. If you want to have this conversation about whether or not the District of Columbia should be this kind of neutral ground and everything else, fair enough. But it is nonsense to say, well, Democrats may get an advantage. You can make that argument about all sorts of things, about be it voting rights, be it gerrymandering, all that stuff. Well, Republicans get an advantage when they gerrymander a district to the point where people are very isolated in regards to their political point of view. And that district has no sense or has no sensical point of view when you're just looking at it from a contextual standpoint. They're basically gaming the business. Hey, that affects the outgrowth of the number of people who go in Congress also. At the very least, from the standpoint of the DC thing, those people should be represented. Give them their representatives or make an argument as to why they shouldn't get them. The Republicans being disadvantaged is not one of them. The White House announced its support earlier Wednesday for reauthorizing VAWA, which aims to reduce domestic and sexual violence and improve the response to it through a variety of grant programs. The latest version of the Violence Against Women Act would establish a new grant program designed to help members of the LGBTQ community to the community. The other measure the House took up on Wednesday will remove the deadline for states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and another attempt to eliminate a deadline passed in 1982 that prevented the Equal Rights Amendment from becoming part of the Constitution. Good. 9 senators on Saturday sent a letter to the Biden administration condemning his handling of the influx of migrants coming to the U.S.-Mexico border and calling for more, quote-unquote, clarity. The senators added that, quote, Congress and the American people must have additional clarity about how DHS and HHS are addressing, unquote, the situation at the border. Republicans have argued that Biden's immediate rollback of Trump era policies created the influx of migrants at the border. The 9 senators are asking for more information from DHS and HHS, including a breakdown of the number of migrants detained since January 20th, the number of migrants tested and vaccinated for COVID-19, estimates for how much time individuals spent in CBP custody before and after testing, and future border apprehension projections. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on Sunday argued migrants not to travel, strongly urged migrants not to travel to the United States, stating, quote, we are encouraging children not to come. Now is not the time to come. Do not come. The journey is dangerous. We are building safe, orderly, and humane ways to address the needs of vulnerable children. Do not come, unquote. That's totally going to do it. That's all you need. I don't understand why other countries didn't just have somebody saying that for their immigration policy. Just have a guy standing at the border saying, don't come. This is not the time for you to come into the country right now. Look, the truth is, Republicans have actually been a little bit more honest on this front. Joe Biden, and some of the problems that Joe Biden is having is basically COVID. He did roll back some of the policies, meaning he is allowing kids to come to the border and is taking those kids in. And the problem is that the number of beds that Donald Trump expanded the number of beds. I think it went to like 13,000. But the problem is with COVID, you have to have certain safety conditions of distance, which means that the number of beds that they have effectively was basically cut by half or something to that effect. Not to mention, as COVID went down, the more people, I would imagine, saw a reason to come. As Joe Biden went in, there's also this other tonal shift, whereas Donald Trump is screaming, snarling, spitting, don't come, and I think you guys are rapists and drug dealers. With Joe Biden and the Democratic Party pushing so firmly and hard against that almost by definition, the very fact that one changes and the other one comes in makes it seem like there's an invitation regardless of the guy that you have at the border screaming, don't come in. So, yes, Joe Biden has a problem at the border. No, Democrats now, for whatever particular reason, after AOC went crying at the border, don't want to talk about the border. Republicans don't want to talk, well, they do want to talk about the border at this point because Joe Biden has all sorts of problems at the border. Shane, what are your thoughts? I watched this and I thought to myself, Republicans have a point here. Joe Biden has a problem at the border. What is Joe Biden going to do about the problem at the border? With one extra catch, one extra caveat. We're more honest about this because we go further and say the only way you can really have an honest conversation about the border is it possible that there's U.S. policy that's creating the problem at the border that goes beyond Joe Biden or Donald Trump allowing people in or not allowing people in, such as either things that we're starting in those countries, drug wars that we've propagated in those various countries, or coups we've propagated in those countries, all of which create firestorms in the various countries to which we're talking about. So you live in a country, that country has all sorts of gangs or violence or, military roaming the streets, and you say, I want my kid to go up in a better place. That's a rational choice. You cross all sorts of hell and high water to get your kid to what you consider to be a better place. That's a rational choice. You hear this guy saying, don't come, and you still send your kid anyway because for you, it's a rational choice. And even from the standpoint of Biden or Trump, there's a belief that there's nothing that these guys are ever going to do that is going to be worse than the situation to which they're coming from. The honest reality of it is, if you're ever really going to have a conversation on this, you have to engage U.S. policy abroad. That means the coups, the wars, or the drug policy. Beyond that, it's a waste. What are your thoughts, Shane?
Well, for one thing, with everybody screaming, "Do not come," the sex jokes would write themselves, but I don't know if I could legally say them on air. So I'm not going to do that. We're just going to completely bypass that. And we're going to talk about the grim reality, which is the Monroe Doctrine never died. The idea that, American supremacy over the Southern Hemisphere in the West, the fact that, the idea that we have sort of territorial hegemony over Central, South America, the Caribbean, all that stuff, it effectively didn't really fade away. All that we've seen against it, I would say, is Cuba as a major standout nation, sort of, standing up against the United States in whatever limited way it's doing so, just by continuing to exist in its form. That never faded away. And what comes with that, of course, is if we've taken responsibility for those affairs, then we need to take responsibility for the whiplash. One small side effect, one small side of which is all of the mass immigration to the north as people flee the conditions that we helped to create, whether it's the drug war and the massive and through Iran-Contra, literally U.S. mandated and U.S. run drug problems, whether it's that or whether you're talking about coups that we do overseas and to our south. We created this problem. So no, the media in the West really doesn't like to talk about that stuff. Thankfully, we do. We're one of the few organizations that is willing to talk about that. But if you're going to put a pin in a problem on the board somewhere, it would be that we created it through our foreign policy.
It's worse than that on some level than the media not talking about it. It's one thing if the media didn't know. They know. Well, what I mean by that is the question that Jen Psaki was asked one day, where the guy said, "Hey, is the president of Honduras a partner?" And the guy kept asking, "Is he a partner? Is he a partner?" Now, the report had just came out in the New York Times. I believe the guy named Hernandez, that he basically said, "I want to put cocaine into the nose of every gringo," or something like that. Like basically, I want to get all the cocaine in the world into the United States. 80% of the cocaine apparently goes through Honduras. Now, why is the interesting question. And you get into this question of Hillary Clinton didn't like Zelaya, and when she had the opportunity to say, "Hey, we're not going to back this coup," which is U.S. policy, "we're not going to back this coup," she didn't do that. She escorted the guy out. She was okay with escorting that guy out because that guy was a troublesome lefty. My point is, the reporter that's asking that question knows everything that I just said is true. He just doesn't want to go there and ask it a little bit more brutally. It's like, well, wait a minute. Does that mean that it was a poor idea for you to escort Zelaya out in that coup? I mean, you are saying that has a negative consequence on basically what happened in Fort Bragg. They would never ask that. Like, they would ask up to a point and then stop. It would never occur to them to say, well, wait a minute, Biden killed 22 people when he got into office. Does that make him a killer too? That seemed to be the most operative question in the world. That question seemed to be screaming to be asked. And nobody could do it. They would say, well, what about MBS? Is he a killer? Oh, that's not what you want to know. That's not what you want to know. Ask what you want to know. Ask what you want to know. Let's do this. Let's end this. These are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in that area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, give us a like or share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. 18 years. We've been in Iraq for 18 years, and the offshoots of that war have been immensely consequential. But even within the context of that war, 4,000 American lives lost, $8 trillion lost, and I would say more consequential, 5,000 or 500,000 to 1 million Iraqis lost. Mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, they had aspirations, dreams, they breathed, they felt pain, they had likes just like you or I, and they were wiped off the face of the earth. George Bush led us into that war. And more importantly, not just George Bush led us into that war, the media gave him a pass on that. The people who were against that war, like Jesse Ventura, were put on ice, or for that matter, Phil Donahue, put on ice. Dissent was crushed. And at the end of that, you didn't have a situation where media was like, whoa, we totally got that one wrong. We need to, beat ourselves over the back and have some level of understanding of that failure and the gravity of that failure. That wasn't it at all. You didn't even have the political class acknowledge the level and scale of that failure, of the number of lives that was lost in a region that was utterly destroyed. We kept moving like business as usual. You even had the situation of Nancy Pelosi saying this. Let's play the clip, Andre.
When I became speaker the first time, there was overwhelming call for me to impeach President Bush on the strength of the war in Iraq, which I vehemently opposed. And again, I said at other places, that was my wheelhouse. I was intelligence. I was a ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, even before I became part of the leadership of Gang of Four. So I knew there were no nuclear weapons in Iraq. It just wasn't there. They had to show us. They had to show the Gang of Four all the intelligence they had. The intelligence did not show that was the case.
Let's stop right there.
So I knew it was a
The intelligence showed that there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The people wanted me to impeach Trump because, based on that, wanted me to impeach George Bush based on that because I knew that Bush led us into a war based on a lie, and that 500,000 human beings were extinguished because of that. $8 trillion lost because of that. 4,000 American lives lost because of that. But Pelosi didn't think it rose to the level of impeachment. The guests that we're going to have a conversation about this, basically Iraq currently and the war 18 years on, Vijay Prasad. Vijay Prasad is director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and chief editor of the Leftward Books. He is a writing fellow and chief correspondent of Globetrotter. You can follow Vijay on Twitter at Vijay Prasad. Vijay, thank you for doing this on short notice. Welcome to the show, man. Vijay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
No. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on. I'm glad you can come on to talk about this with me, because this is one of those subjects that I've always been astonished by. More so the way that the American media encounters the subject and the political class encountered the subject. 500,000 people on the low end were wiped off the face of the earth. And we don't seem to appreciate the scale and the level of that crime. Please, what is Iraq like today as a result of those actions?
So I'm glad you're doing this show, and I'm glad to be able to talk about this. I covered that war, and it was not an easy war to cover because the violence was extreme. And I don't think it's just 500,000. I think we have the estimates, the low estimates are over 1 million dead. 50% of Iraq's middle class fled as a consequence of that war. The use of depleted uranium, particularly in Fallujah and Ramadi, has created generations of children born with terrible, terrible problems. The level of mental illness, trauma in the country is extraordinary. The polarization along sectarian lines has only deepened as a consequence of the United States war on Iraq. I want to make a point about the language we use, if I may, because people talk about the Iraq war, but there really is no Iraq war. There was no Iraq war in 2003. There is a United States attack on Iraq. There is a US war on Iraq. In the same way as there was no Vietnam war. There was no war in Vietnam. There was the US imposed war on Vietnam. The United States has these wars. These are US wars on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on Vietnam, on Libya. There's no Libya war. There's no Afghanistan war. I think this is a way in which we remove culpability for these wars. In this particular case, you played the clip from Nancy Pelosi. There's something quite horrendous here, because you see, it's not a question of whether there were weapons of mass destruction or not. It's not a question of that. That's an internal US debate between the Democrats, Republicans, and whatever, fragment of the anti-war movement exists. The real issue is this was a war prosecuted against international law. It was prosecuted against the UN Charter. It was a war of aggression, which is why a year after the war, in 2004, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, told BBC, called it an illegal war. It's an illegal war because there was no authorization from the UN Security Council for that war. So really, it doesn't matter whether, Mr. Bush or Blair, if they're impeached or whatever happens, those are internal issues. The real issue is these are international war criminals. They prosecuted a war of aggression against the Iraqi people. This is something that's very clearly laid out in the UN Charter. And therefore, these men, including Dick Cheney and so on, should have been brought before the International Criminal Court. At least a dossier should have been opened, an investigation should have been carried out. Nothing was done like that. I actually don't care about whether they get impeached or not. I'm more concerned about the sanctity of international law. And these are war criminals. And it's not me saying that out of some sort of moral, reflexive, imprecise language. This is based on what the UN Secretary General said in 2004. If Kofi Annan says that it's an illegal war, then the men who prosecuted that war have done something illegal, which is that they've done something criminal. Hence, because this is a war, they are war criminals. This is absolutely based on what the Secretary General said, not just my opinion.
Agreed. Again, Vijay, thank you for joining us. Shane here. Really appreciate you being willing to join us. There are a couple of different strands I wanted to follow up on, but I'll follow up on the last that you brought up. I also want to come back at some point to your coverage of the Iraq War, because it would just be great to hear from somebody who was on the ground, even though tragic circumstances and ones that, the Iraqis are still living with to this day. It would be good to hear from you in some more depth what you saw specifically, where you were, when you were there, et cetera. But I want to follow up on the last comments that you were making about how what you're deeply concerned about here is the degradation of the sanctity of international law. This is a conversation Jamarl and I have been having over recent months, but we had this a couple of times the last week. The idea that the United States presided over the creation of various international orders, albeit whether they're economic orders or the creation of the United Nations, in which the United States has arguably played the largest part historically, and yet we seem to be the ones to desanctify it, to have corrupted it for our own ends over the decades. Where I guess I'm curious, why is that what you're worried about here? What perspective brings that into the limelight as the cause for your concern? It seems to me, if you're going to live in an international order, either you're going to have just laws or unjust laws presiding over that order. And it seems that on some level, there are always going to be forces that lend individual countries and individual organizations to try to corrupt those international orders. The problem, of course, comes in when the strongest parties at hand are the ones trying to do that corrupting. Why is that what worries you? What can we do to walk it back? And what do you see for the future of international norms and international laws specifically, BJ?
Well, you saw recently that Mr. Biden, President Joe Biden, called Vladimir Putin a killer. I thought that was very interesting because he made that comment on the 19th of March. This is a significant day because it's on this day in 2003 that the United States launched its most recent attack on Iraq. So on the 19th of March 2003, the United States opened that flank of the war in Iraq, which of course had opened in 1990. It's a very long war, but the new kind of invasion took place in 2000. On that day, on the anniversary of that day, Biden called Putin a killer. I thought that was very interesting. That's also the day when the French and the United States, under the aegis of the NATO alliance, attacked Libya in 2011, the 19th of March. This is the same day. There's a word that we have in the English language, and the word is impunity. If you are exempt from punishment from known crimes, if you are exempt from punishment of known crimes, if it's known that you've done something criminal for which there's been no investigation, no trial, there's nobody found guilty, no justice, in other words, if there's impunity from a known crime, then it's likely the crime will be repeated because you then have confidence that nobody is going to criticize you. So the United States goes ahead and invades Iraq in 2003, destroys the country, just as the United States had done in 1999 under the aegis of NATO when it bombed Yugoslavia. At the time, by the way, also bombing the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. It's a story that I think bears remembering now with this hotted up conflict against China. If you don't have a sense of your history, if you don't come back and see, oh, good, well, we did this and it was against the law, and something happened, so maybe we should think twice about doing it again. If you don't, have justice for crimes committed in the past, then you'll repeat the crimes. And this is exactly what, in a way, sequentially has been the problem in the history of the United States, is that because it basically has not been found, called to account for any of its, let's call them criminal wars, it continues to repeat them. There's no barrier. Nobody's worried about anything. I mean, look at this. Just a few weeks about coming into office, Joe Biden authorizes a missile strike at a village on the border between Syria and Iraq. Now, that's very interesting. The group that they struck had been named as a terrorist group by the United States in 2009. That's Kataib Hezbollah. What was the allegation against the people in that village? And, we think about 22 to 30 people died in that attack. It's not confirmed properly. But what was the allegation? Well, in Erbil at the airport, some rockets were fired at an installation that's controlled by the US military and some of its contractors. People were hurt and so on. So there's an accusation that somebody fired rockets into Erbil. Several things should be unpacked here. What is the U.S. doing in Erbil? Why is there a United States government installation in Erbil in Iraq? It has no authorization to be there. They shouldn't be there. Anyway, there was an attack on that installation. Who did the attack? We don't know. There's no evidence. There's no evidence presented to the public domain. All we have is the United States saying we know who did it and we're going to strike them in the name of defending the homeland. Where is the US homeland? How close is the US homeland to the Iraq-Syria border? There's a level of absurdity here, and nobody is going to be called to account.
Well,
there'll be no investigation.
VJ, to make that worse, nobody's even asked. We don't even ask those questions. The media doesn't even bring that up. Like, that's not, like, what you just said and the conversations we have about that doesn't come up. Hey, why are we in Syria? What justification do we have to make that strike? Why do you believe that we should be able to defend something in a foreign country that we don't supposed to be in? Why is it okay to strike Syria at all? Like, none of that stuff comes up. Even the people who got killed. I remember, I made the point of reading, we have to close this out, but the New York Times is great. There's a piece in it where it says Iranian-backed group. And then you get, I think it was like 8 paragraphs in where it says it's unknown whether or not this group is backed by Iran. It's phenomenal. The way our media engages this is astonishing. And I love the fact that you brought that up because we're going to hit that on the very next segment. Vijay Prasad, the voice that you were listening to is Vijay Prasad, director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and chief editor of Leftward Books. He's also writing fellow and chief correspondent at Globetrotter. You can follow Vijay on Twitter at Vijay Prasad, and we are going to be back with him in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined for this segment, continuing our conversation from the last, by Vijay Prasad. He's the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and chief editor of Leftward Books. He is also a writing fellow and chief correspondent at Globetrotter. You can follow Vijay on Twitter at Vijay Prasad. Vijay, thank you again for being with us. I want to come back to something that you opened up, a conversation that very much interested in me, which is your coverage of the war in Iraq. Can you please just go into that? When did you go there? What did you see? And how did what you see contrast with what you saw the war being portrayed as in American and Western media, Vijay?
Easy to cover a war like Iraq because in 2003, for instance, the temptation was to sign up with American troops and go in with the U.S. Army as what was then called the embedded reporters. People went in embedded with US troops and so on, or behind US lines. It was difficult to go on the other side to see the situation from the standpoint of the Iraqis. And particularly if you don't have a lot of resources, it's hard to do that. There was Iraqi media covering it from that side. So in 2003-4, it was almost impossible for people without resources, without a major agency backing them to go. So the thing is that people like me, we could only go later, 2006, 7, 8, around then. But then the war was really hotted up because that was the period, after the battles in Ramadi, Fallujah, when the insurgency was in full flight. And, one of the things I saw in a place like Baghdad, which is, a major city, a beautiful city, what one saw was people you met, whether they were middle-class people, working-class people or so on, everybody seemed to me to be impacted by the war. Somebody had lost somebody had been badly injured. I was invited to the home of of people I had befriended. You know, he was a journalist. She was also a journalist, but was not at the time working. And I went into their home, and you know, I went to eat dinner there, and they were very nice, urbane people. And I noticed she had a headscarf on her face, and she kept turning her face away from me. And I thought, this is a curious thing, you know. They are not particularly religious people. What's happening? And then at one moment, the headscarf slipped, and I saw that she had very badly scarred on the side of her face. And of course, it was a car bomb or some kind of explosion in the street. Um, you know, in New Baghdad city, for instance, where the insurgency was very hot, we were hearing rumors always of how helicopter gunships were just mowing down people. U.S. helicopter gunships, Apache helicopters mowing down people, but there was never enough evidence of it. You know, and you might remember this. You will remember this particular. Instance of that war when these helicopter gunships were just firing into crowds in Iraq. We don't know how many people died as a consequence. I remember being reading David Finkel's reporting from the Washington Post. And, you know, what one was seeing was people saying that, look, this is what's happening. It's terrible. We just walk down the street and, you know, if there's a scuffle somewhere, if people start to have any kind of scuffle, these helicopter gunships appear and they just fire at you. David Finkel wrote about a particular incident exactly there in New Baghdad city, where a photographer, Namir Noor El-Din, and his driver, Saeed Chamag, were killed, as well as other people. And David Finkel writes that, you know, the Apache crew followed the rules of engagement. That's what he wrote in his book. It's called The Good Soldiers. He wrote about how after that incident, which took place on the 12th of July, 2007, just when, you know, when one was in New Baghdad city at the time, you know, he writes and says that, well, after that particular incident on that day, the good soldiers came home for dinner. I remember underlying that line in his book, thinking, this is insane. He writes in the book that there's a video of that incident. And even despite the fact that the US Pentagon refused to release the video, in fact, said there wasn't a video, Finkel in 2009 writes in his book, says there's a video, you know, claims to have watched it. Well, it's thanks to Chelsea Manning and the WikiLeaks organization that video was released on the 8th of January 2010. You know, now 11 years ago. It was published on YouTube as Collateral Murder. And I really hope people go and see this, because this is what we were hearing from people. We were hearing about this level of violence and callousness. If you watch that video, you listen to the pilots say things, and I don't know if I can even say this on the air, but, you know, look at the dead XYZ, just horrendous, firing this 30mm rounds from up there in the sky into the crowd and killing Reuters photographer and his driver.
They didn't even get the right people. Yeah. Didn't even hit the right people. Well, they didn't even know who they were killing.
There is no right people. That's the point.
Yeah.
What is the right people? I
mean, I just mean that from the standpoint of who they were who they consider to be fair game. I mean, like the guy writing A Good Soldier, in his head, the people who are here killing are, you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to make this distinction between...
But I'll tell you something interesting about that. I talked to a U.S. soldier, a Marine, in fact, and I asked the Marine, Marine came from California, and I asked the Marine, what do you think about what you're doing here? And his answer was quite beautiful. He said, in my neighborhood in Southern California, if somebody invaded it, I would pick up a gun and I would fight them. And that's what I mean, is that, even the insurgents who were defending their land, were they the right people to kill? I'm not sure. I don't think there was anybody correct to kill there. I think that the presence of the U.S. troops was the problem. And there was no good target. There were no good soldiers. And the honest U.S. soldiers who served in Iraq will tell you that.
Yeah.
That this was not a war that had any honor for anybody.
No, it was a war of aggression. And I think, it's just a strange way that we talk about it here. I mean, even the media gives it a pass. The way that you just described it, that the United States invaded a country, that country fought back. And in the context of that country fighting back, we considered it or called it a war, as if there were two equal sides that were fighting in this war. There weren't. One side was attacked. There's a difference in those things. No, you're right. I appreciate that. We just never talk about it in those terms. It's never expressed in those terms. It's never even expressed in the terms of, do people have a legitimate right to defend themselves if they're being attacked or if their homeland is being attacked? And we would give that right to anybody under normal circumstances, providing we're not the people that's invading it, or providing that the country that's doing that is not at war or is not an enemy of ours. It's very strange. Our Western media, for example, gives Bush a pass on this. In fact, I showed the video earlier where Bush was laughing about it at the White House press conference, despite the fact that so many people died. It's extraordinarily callous, to put it mildly. How do you frame that? How does a society get so callous where they can kill that many people, get it that wrong, and on top of getting it that wrong, not even having a conversation about whether or not they were right, even if they were right, if that makes sense?
Well, I just published a book called Washington Bullets, which has the history of the CIA assassinations and, well, I suppose coup d'etats, really. There's a level of callousness that sets into a society that believes it's the greatest society in the world. I mean, look, President Obama, the gold standard for US liberalism, published his new memoir. It's called Promised Land. It's an odd title. Why is the United States a promised land? What makes the United States the greatest country in the world? Why is it greater than other countries? That's a level of arrogance that I think people need to reflect on. I mean, do you really want to live with the belief that you are better than other people? I mean, isn't that form of hierarchical thinking objectionable to you yourself? Isn't it rattle your morality? In Obama's book, Promised Land, he has a chapter on the kill list. I think it was on Tuesday, he used to sit with his national security team and they'd give him a list of names of people that the United States wanted to execute all around the world. Now, Obama, constitutional lawyer, liberal and so on, against the death penalty, writes in this book, and this is stunning. This has exactly come to the point of that callousness. In the book, he writes, I'm not putting words into his mouth. This is his looking back at his time in office, when he has a chance to sort of revise what he did. He authorized the killing of, hundreds, thousands of people without a trial, without even a warrant, without them knowing that they were to be killed. That's the stunning thing about this. They were not even, there was no habeas corpus, forget all that. They were just killed. And he writes in the book that the reason he went along with this is that his chief of staff said that if a liberal president, didn't do things like this, then he would give the appearance of weakness. In order not to appear weak, Obama authorized the killing of hundreds of people. Now, you tell me, who is the killer in the world now? I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to be sort of over the top or whatever it is. I'm asking a very rational question. Here is somebody who authorized without any, procedures, no legal procedures, the execution of perhaps hundreds, thousands of people. We don't know the exact number. He admits to that. He says he did it. He doesn't deny it. In a book called The Promised Land, he says he did it not because of moral right or anything. He did it because he didn't want to appear weak.
And to make that worse, civilians, the civilians that died as a result. I mean, I could show you some of the reports where 90% of the people that were killed in some cases were civilians. Meaning they weren't even hitting the people that they wanted. I guess that's what I'm kind of getting at. It's not so much that I'm trying to say that some people are right to kill or not. I guess I'm trying to make the point that even under their own model of the world, they were wrong. And thousands died as a result of them being just wrong. It's profound. I give it to you, I think you're right. It's this notion of everybody else is lesser. We are the ones that are better and the ones that are enlightened enough to make these choices about who dies and who lives. That's what I think it comes from. Vijay, absolutely great conversation. My people in the background are like, wow, he's good. He's so eloquent. He's on point. I'm so glad you could join us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure anytime.
Okay. Absolutely. The voice that you guys were listening to is Vijay Prasad, director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and chief editor of Leftward Books. He's also writing fellow and chief correspondent at Globetrotter. You can follow Vijay on Twitter at Vijay Prasad. And the channel that you guys are tuned into is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give
most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. That's right. This is an open segment. More often than not recently, I'll just put it like this, Jamarl. At 8:45, we used to have these open segments where we take calls or do a dedicated conversation, but more often than not, we've had guests filling this segment. So that has left the call-in segment at the end of the show like the only opportunity for people to join the conversation. It's not that much time, and frequently we don't have enough time to get to everybody who wants it, but now is a good opportunity if you want to join us. 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. And also, Jamarl, quick comment here. I'm sorry for jumping in at the end. You were right to do the outro. It's just you mentioned people on the back end saying he's eloquent. I'm like, that's me, dude. That's me. That's me in our chat. I'm like, guys, he's good. He's eloquent. He's deep. I like him.
Yeah, he's good,
anyway,
man. I told you. I
I
used to see him before, and I was like, wow, that guy's awesome. And so when I saw him, I think I saw him on Twitter, and I was like, I wonder if he'll come on. It'd be great to have him on to talk about the 9/11, not the 9/11, the Iraq War stuff. So he hit me up. He said yes, and he was willing to come on at short notice. So yeah, he's awesome.
It's true, and I think he mentioned the invasions of Iraq and Libya taking place on March 19th, but also those are both within the past decade. Within still within the past decade, I think a couple days earlier was the start of civil unrest in Syria, which was part of the Arab Spring, which was driven in an overwhelming number of cases by the U.S. State Department, and that's just in the past decade. You have three different incidences of U.S. aggression, and Syria, we're still living through that one. I mean, of course, the Iraqis are still suffering the consequences of that war. The Libyans, the same. Syria, still at war, still in a state of war, still in a state of, invasion and proxy conflict, driven first and foremost, I would say, by the United States. Another part of this that we're we didn't need to get into it in the last conversation, but the creation of ISIS, which for years there was the chief boogeyman taking over from Al-Qaeda and, America's self-stated war on terrorism. And yet we created Al-Qaeda, we created the conditions for ISIS. It's not a good thing to be doing.
It's the weirdest thing in the world.
Key in the creation of Al-Qaeda.
The United States, the media never explains how Idlib is a haven for terrorists, and yet Trump was willing to end the world to defend Idlib. Like, it's very strange. They never accept that, or they never deal with that. It's like you have reports where the CIA or terrorists backed by the CIA were fighting terrorists backed by the military. And they never engage in that. It's like, is it strange that you have these guys that are just so happen fighting each other and that they're there at the behest of various aspects of the U.S. government? Is it possible that those guys are terrorists? And is it possible that we're backing those guys for some pursuit? We never engage that stuff. The New York Times will run it after Obama leaves. After he leaves. Meaning we can have these conversations about $1 billion spent here or there to try to topple a particular government. No, we can't have those conversations while they're taking place. And more importantly, after it happens, the media never brings it up. The media acts like it's part of like a history that can't be counted, can't be talked about.
No, it is in their best interest. They want to discard it at every chance. What I was going to say was, but Trump did. This is the weird, more hate than love, but the weird love-hate relationship I have with Trump, which is he brought up the fact that that the American policy, and Obama specifically, had been backing ISIS. And he was asking the question, why are we doing this? That's the question that needs to be asked. I just wish it wasn't left to Donald Trump to ask it.
Well, Tulsi asked. In fact, Tulsi went on, CNN and asked. And what did Jake Tapper do? Jake Tapper recoiled. Well, the government said it's not doing that. Like, I mean, honestly, if you're doing it and you can't, just own it, right? But you can't own it. You can't own it. You can't own that. I guess what bothers me more so is that all of those people died in Iraq, and we act like they're not people. because there's no consequence. Like, if they were human beings, there's a consequence, right? If a person is shot or whatever, the police takes all sorts of measures to say, all right, we're going to investigate this crime. We're going to prosecute it because we say life has value. And we even make this argument when we're talking about other countries. We use human rights as a reason and as rationale to go into other countries and everything else. However, media accepts almost as a premise of cosmic reality that it is our right to do those things. It is our right. It is our right to get rid of Maduro. It is our right to be able to tell Bashar al-Assad to leave. These are other countries. This is not on the border of Oklahoma. These are in other countries in entirely different spheres of the world. And we are saying they must go. And the American media would agree and say they must go. And they would say we are independent. And they would own that. They believe it. We're independent. How dare you say we're not independent media? Nonsense. They are so complicit. Go watch the State Department briefing and read the New York Times. They're not that far apart. They're not that far apart.
They transcribe. The New York Times transcribes the State Department briefings. Of course, that's sort of a joke. It's not a joke because it's serious, but they're just stenographers, effectively. This is, you know what? This is another conversation. But have you been following the conflict of conscience or something like that over Substack? This new platform?
No. Fill me in on that one. I heard somebody mention I think I heard Glenn Greenwald mention Substack or something like that. But it's
yes.
Vague.
Yeah. So by the way, we were taking calls 202-521-1320. Our audio engineer stepped out to the bathroom for a minute. Sorry for giving that away, Andre. But anyway, we're now fully in the process of taking calls again. 202-521-1320. The deal with Substack. Glenn Greenwald has been writing about it. I've also seen a Matt Iglesias formerly from Vox, talking about it. Basically, Substack is an independent publishing platform that lets writers publish content, and people can subscribe to it on a monthly basis or a yearly basis and pay you money. So it's basically a way to give writers specifically a sort of Patreon funding model where you can go directly to subscribers. And Glenn Greenwald, when he left The Intercept, he switched over to Substack. He seems to be doing pretty darn well over there. At Iglesias, he's making a couple $100K at least a year, and that's with a deal that he got with the organization. If he hadn't taken that deal, which just gives him like stability in the amount of money he makes, he'd be making close to $1 million on a yearly basis, assuming his current number of subscribers. So there's a lot of money to be made for it. And Taylor Lorenz, who we've been talking about, we talked about her briefly, I believe, last week with Tucker Carlson going after Taylor Lorenz on Twitter and on his show, and them pushing back. Journalists mainstream journalists in the mainstream wing of the media, whatever, have been criticizing Substack pretty remorselessly, pretty constantly and viciously. And the best guess here is because it actually poses a genuine threat to their business model. There are all these interesting takes that I've seen from people over this. But I guess where I'm going with this is it's a new debate in media between an old funding model, newspapers where you have an organization of people who are all working together, and part of one interesting aspect of this debate is you have stronger writers who attract a lot of the readership, who are sort of subsidizing in some aspects a lot of the weaker writers who don't attract as many people. But what you get is a sort of well-rounded news publication. In the new model, it's all strong writers. It's all sort of meritocracy or something like it, at least, where if you're a really good writer, if you're a really good journalist, if you're good at doing the thing that people want you to be doing, you're going to have outsized success there. And a lot of the old journalists in the status quo, the way things have been for a long time, are afraid of this, is my best guess. They really don't like it. And so they're pushing back against Substack, the platform, and against the people who are on it. Glenn Greenwald has been attacked for years now on all sorts of grounds. But a lot of the more recent attacks have been weirdly related to Substack in a way. Oh, and one of the big things that people are criticizing, one of the big things that the mainstream journalists don't like about Substack is that they have not been censoring. So they haven't been pushing out views that a lot of people don't like. You can be right wing, you can be left wing, whatever. You can take your own take, and mainstream journalists really don't like that. So it's like it's part of the culture war conversation. It's part of the conversation about how new media is going to work. It's just an interesting thing going on. We should get somebody on to talk about that. We do have calls right now, however. 202-521-1320 is the number. Let's go to Shelley calling in from Michigan. Shelley, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Love the guest today, but he left me with a question, and I figured I'd just ask you guys. As an American, how would you suggest we combat American arrogance?
Thing.
Oh man, tell the truth. I guess the way that I think about this is I still love America. I'm an American first and foremost, and I'm trying to do what I think is best for America, which is to get us to stop wasting so much money overseas, killing other people, and putting ourselves in a situation of long-term financial, military, and social risk. But what comes with that is realizing we're not the biggest country in the world. We're not the most populated country in the world. We're no longer the most technologically advanced country in the world. We're one of a number of countries, which is special in its own right. But I don't take the tack that America in all these different domains is exceptional. We have some exceptional advantages, and we should use them and try to build up on them. But I don't treat the United States with complete dejection, or I don't want to insult it too deeply, but at the same time, you need to add in the context that shows, no, we failed in a lot of different ways, and we really need to fix those failures. Jamarl, though, what's your take?
So, I exist in a world where most of the things that are around me are not true. They're just subjective. And that is not the easiest world to exist in, because other people don't function that way. They function with a solid world. So for them, that arrogance is ingrained. They don't see it. Joe Biden, Obama, they accept it as a basis of action that America has a right and justification to murder and kill, etc. And that is not something that they were born with. That's something that they were indoctrinated with over the course of time in being in this country. I think all of us are on some level. I confront that more so by getting across to people that they are wrong, and to be able to show the distinction between the reality of things, its comparison to physical matter reality, versus the falseness of their illusions about these kind of indispensability and all of this other nonsense. None of that stuff is real. And my objective is to get across to them that it is not. Sometimes the most jarring way is to just show them how they're wrong in comparison to reality. So one person, I had this conversation about North Korea. She was like, oh, those people are crazy. Great. I get to engage somebody who's basically randomly telling me that North Korea is crazy. Why do you think they're crazy? Well, they keep sending off missiles. Is it possible that they have a reason for doing that? What would that reason possibly be? I'm glad you asked me what would that reason possibly be. Does it have to have anything to do with the freedom of movement exercises where we're pretending to invade their country over and over again, and they keep saying they don't like it? When did they say they don't like it? They say it all the time. They say it all the time. Is it possible that the nuclear weapon is prevention for us invading their country? Why would they ever think that? We invaded Iraq. We invaded Libya. We invaded Syria. Why would they think differently? That's what I like to do. It's confrontational. The person is like, whoa, how do I get out of this? Yeah, you started it by saying something stupid. My job is to show you the distinction between what you just said with the reality of those events. And hopefully, as you leave bruised, annoyed, upset that you were engaged in this particular conversation, maybe on some level you think to yourself, hey, that guy's right. Is it going to jar everybody? No. Will it jar some? Yes. And would it be effective? That's how I hit my head on this whole notion of the politics stuff. What's the difference between Obama versus the reality of things? It was that. That's my thought. That's adversarial, but it's the way I function. It's the way I think. Tarif, New Orleans. What's up, Tarif?
Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. Free Julian Assange, we have some good news for Julian Assange. They had 10 diplomats from Australia met with a embassy in Australia, saying that the charges should be dropped. It was 10 people from different parties from Australia. That was a good sign, that, you can't give up. You gotta keep on fighting. You never know what'll come up. Thank God they done that. I was reading an article that the U.S. talking about putting sanctions on India because India want to buy the S-400.
Wait a minute. Tarif, I saw that. We're going to end because we're only at like 30 seconds. I saw that. And they were basically warned, hey, if you want to avoid those sanctions, you don't need to buy those Russian weapons. And I guess I made the point of saying, well, maybe you need to build weapons that are cheaper and that work as well, and that you don't have to do this nonsense about threatening countries to buy your products. Let's go to our next, we're going to have to end this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back up with the last hour of headlines. Back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more from across our divided nation and the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good morning again. Whether you're just waking up or you've been with us for the full 2 hours so far, hope you're having a great morning. Getting into the headlines in a second here. Just a brief overview of today's show. At 7:30, we spoke with Alexander Mercouris about EU vaccine policy, whether or not they take the Sputnik V vaccine from Russia, France's strict lockdown, and the sort of balance of power and the balance of considerations between the European Union and Russia, whether or not we'll see a détente, some easing of relations between the two, or whether things will get worse. I also talked about the idea of a Eurasian power bloc. Again, that was Alexander Mercouris at 7:30 a.m. Eastern this morning. In the last hour, from 8:15 to 8:45, we had a great conversation with Vijay Prashad. I believe his first appearance on any edition of Fault Lines. Great combo with him, director of Tricontinental, author, and a skilled and eloquent thinker and speaker. We talked about the Iraq War, his coverage of the Iraq War, how the media has treated it, the degradation of international law as the United States has continually perpetrated unjust wars abroad. And, like he said, many presidents are effectively war criminals. The fact that they're not being treated as such means that Americans do not have, Americans have impunity effectively. They're stumbling over trying to figure out exactly how to say that, but that's the simplest way. And that they shouldn't. It's not good for the United States or other countries for American aggression to go unaddressed and unpunished. Anyway, in this last hour, we're going to be talking with Morgan Archuquina about the state of news media and Camila Escalante about what's going on in Bolivia and the Western media's take on what's going on in Bolivia, as Janine Áñez, former coup leader head of state there, was recently arrested. We'll be coming back to that later on in this hour. First up, in the headlines, in COVID news, at least 444 new coronavirus deaths and 34,217 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 54,404 cases per day. That's a decrease of 7% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 29,842,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus. Almost 542,000, meanwhile, have died from it. In national news, on Monday, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform is holding a hearing on a bill to establish D.C. as the nation's 51st state. In January, Eleanor Holmes Norton reintroduced H.R. 51, which would create the state of Washington Douglas Commonwealth, named for Frederick Douglass. The measure would give D.C. 2 U.S. senators and a voting representative in the House. Statehood faces opposition by Republicans who argue it's an attempt by Democrats to shore up their majorities by adding more seats in Congress. The White House announced its support earlier Wednesday for reauthorizing VAWA, V-A-W-A, that's the Violence Against Women Act, which aims to reduce domestic sexual violence and improve the response to it through a variety of grant programs. The latest version of the Violence Against Women Act would establish a new grant program designed to help members of the LGBTQ+ community. The other measure the House took up Wednesday would remove the deadline for states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment in another attempt to eliminate a deadline passed in 1982 that has prevented the Equal Rights Amendment from becoming part of the Constitution. 9 senators on Saturday sent a letter to the Biden administration condemning his handling of the influx of migrants coming to the U.S.-Mexico border and calling for more clarity. We'll come back to that in a minute here. The senators added that, quote, Congress and the American people must have additional clarity about how DHS and HHS are addressing, end quote, the situation at the border. Republicans have argued that Biden's immediate rollback of Trump-era policies created the current influx of migrants at the border. The 9 senators are asking for more information from DHS and HHS, including a breakdown of the number of migrants detained since January 20th, the number of migrants tested and vaccinated for COVID-19, estimates for how much time individuals spend in CBP custody before and after testing, and future border apprehension projects. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on Sunday urged migrants not to travel to the United States, stating this, and I would argue this is pretty clear. This is what I said we come back to. This has clarity in it. Quote, "We are encouraging children not to come. Now is not the time to come. Do not come. The journey is dangerous. We are building safe, orderly, and humane ways to address the needs of vulnerable children. Do not come," end quote. Again, pretty clear in my book, but, admittedly, Biden kind of was promising the some versions of the exact opposite, trying to swing the pendulum the other direction from Trump's policies of pushing back pretty strongly against immigration. But this is where we are now. Anyway, on to our next headline. Mayoral candidate Andrew Yang found himself on the end of a hate and love reaction at a Stop Asian Hate rally in Chinatown Sunday when he called for more funding for the NYPD's Asian Hate Crimes Task Force, as he told the crowd that, quote, "One of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to fully fund the Asian Hate Crimes Task Force," end quote. His statement was initially met with applause, but others in the crowd then booed and chanted, "Defund the police." Hearing the crowd's reaction, Yang surprisingly doubled down, stating, quote, "I know that there are people that are very passionate about this, but the fact is, when someone gets stabbed, you need the police to follow up," end quote. Later, Yang could be seen moving through the crowd while young activists follow him, continuing their defund chant from earlier. Sunday's rally was held in response to last Tuesday's massacre in Atlanta of 8 people, including 6 Asian women. And on that subject, federal and local law enforcement investigators have yet to find concrete evidence that would be enough to build a federal hate crime case against the man accused of killing 8 people at 3 Atlanta area spas. The suspect was charged Wednesday with 8 counts of murder. 6 of the victims were women of Asian descent. After probing electronic devices and conducting interviews, investigators have seen no evidence leading in the direction of a hate crime. The suspect allegedly told investigators that he had a sexual addiction, quote unquote, and saw the businesses that he targeted as a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate, quote unquote. In international news, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin arrived in New Delhi for a 3-day visit on Friday, during which he had held talks with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, and Foreign Minister Subramanian Jaishankar. Lloyd's surprise trip comes amid Washington's review of the Doha Agreement with the Taliban, as the promised deadline for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan is drawing closer. The Taliban movement urged the U.S. to complete the pullout of its troops from Afghanistan by the 1st of May, as agreed last year. Biden said that the final decision on the pullout of troops was yet to be made, and Washington was consulting with its allies on the matter. In Myanmar last week, it was announced that the military had issued arrest warrants for 11 staff members of George Soros' Open Society Foundation Myanmar, including its head and deputy head, on suspicion of giving financial support to the civil disobedience movement against the military junta. The military also seized control of the bank accounts of OSF, that's the Open Society Foundation, in Myanmar, amounting to about $3.81 million, $3,810,000, and announced that it will take legal action against the foundation. It accuses OSF Myanmar of violating multiple financial restrictions on the activities of organizations interfering in domestic affairs. The most prominent accusation is a failure to obtain approval from the Central Bank of Myanmar's Foreign Exchange Management Department for depositing about $5 million with the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Bank in Myanmar in 2018. OSF Myanmar is also accused of illegally withdrawing $1.4 million from its account at SMED, that is again the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Bank, a week after the military junta takeover in Myanmar. OSF on Tuesday called for the immediate release of a staff member held in Myanmar and said allegations of financial misconduct were false. The Republic of Congo's top presidential opposition candidate, Guy Brice Parfait Coleilas, has died. Coleilas was last seen in a video circulating Saturday on social media in which he told supporters he was fighting death. In his recent days, he had been particularly critical of the reigning leader, Sassou Nguesso, declaring that the Republic of Congo had become a police state, quote unquote. Sassou Nguesso is the 3rd longest-serving president in Africa. Voting in the Republic of Congo's election took place this Sunday, and results are expected to come in this week. Meanwhile, in Tanzania, President John Magufuli, known as the Bulldozer, has died at a hospital in Dar es Salaam, the country's vice president announced in a televised address on Wednesday. Magufuli was one of Africa's most prominent COVID skeptics. He claimed his country had eradicated coronavirus by the grace of God, questioned the safety of foreign COVID-19 vaccines, and made no plan to procure any shots for his country, instead pushing for the use of herbal medicine and steam treatments. Tanzania hasn't reported COVID-19 figures since April 2020. Samia Suluhu Hassan is now the acting president of Tanzania. She was sworn in on Friday as Tanzania's first female president.
To be fair,
Shane,
Shane,
chuckling at the use of use of herbal medicine and steam treatments there.
To be fair, Shane, it's possible he just didn't get enough steam treatments. Meaning 5 might have did it. He only might have had 3. So we don't know as a flat fact that guy died. By the same token, the skepticism of it is phenomenal. Maybe he was so pro-female that he took that course knowing that the other woman was going to get in office, being the first woman in Tanzania to be a female for president of Tanzania. That's unfair. That's wrong. I'm going with the whole 5 versus 3 warm herbal baths or something that he didn't get.
Yeah, not enough time in the sauna, basically.
Right, right. That's astonishing.
I mean, for a lot of people, that just sounds like a pleasant afternoon. Herbal medicine, I think we know what you mean there, Mr. Former President of Tanzania. No, I'm just kidding. And steam treatments, again, that sounds like at the very least.
But there's evidence for that. Remember the pot stuff, the CBD and everything else. Supposedly, pot had an effect, making it difficult for the person to.
Yes.
If it was that level of herbal medicine, he probably would still be here. Wrong herbal medicine, buddy.
If that's what it was. Oh man. All right. Let me get back here. I want to come back on the Elon Musk thing. I've been stampeding through these headlines because I want to give us enough time on the other side to debate that for a couple minutes. But hey, let's get into it. The value of the Turkish lira dropped sharply. This is 2 days after Turkey's President Erdogan fired the head of the country's central bank. The 3rd time he's fired the head of that organization in the last couple of years. In tech news, Tesla CEO Elon Musk has responded to criticism of his huge wealth by Senator Bernie Sanders, saying he would use his money to help humankind. Sanders is on record criticizing Musk, stating, quote, "We are in a moment in American history where 2 guys, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, own more wealth than the bottom 40% of people in this country. And that, quote, that level of greed and inequality is not only immoral, it is unsustainable," end quote. In response, Musk said he was accumulating resources to help make life multiplanetary. Musk, who also runs SpaceX, said last year that he planned to send 1 million people to Mars by 2050, creating a, quote, lot of jobs, end quote, on the red planet, on which there are currently, I think, none, unless you count the space rovers as jobs.
Just so we're clear, that's not the full quote. You're missing part of that quote for Elon Musk. He says, I kept saying, I was like, that doesn't sound right. Something's missing. Elon Musk says, quote, "I am accumulating resources to help make life multiplanetary and extend the light of consciousness to the stars." Oh, that's the part that makes it special. That's the part you can't leave out. Elon Musk is going to extend the light of consciousness to the stars. And the first part, Elon Musk, I am personally accumulating resources to help make life interplanetary. Are you now, Elon Musk? You are personally accumulating resources to make that work. I would imagine so is Jeff Bezos, so are the Waltons, so is every other billionaire that believes they're indispensable. Go for it.
Jeff Bezos specifically actually is. No, it's just Jeff Bezos specifically actually is. He has the company, I think it's called Blue Origin, which is just not nearly as successful as Elon Musk, but it's also a spaceship company, effectively.
Is it? I didn't know that. I didn't know Jeff Bezos has his own rocket ship. I wouldn't be shocked.
It is, but Elon Musk is better at it. And it is a little rocket ship. It is compared to the starships that Elon Musk, that SpaceX is creating. It is a little rocket ship. Not that we're getting into a conversation about size here. It's not the size of the rocket ship. It's the strength of your propulsion systems or something. I don't know how that carries over, but anyway.
No, I feel where you're going. My only point is this. And like I said in the tweet, I said, I love how people with no survival concerns and enough money to singularly end world poverty talk about the light of consciousness. You were bragging about people being murdered in Bolivia a year ago. Because he was. When he was like, we can coup whoever we want. Now, mind you, whether Elon Musk was joking or whether Elon Musk was serious, how many people were killed in that coup? How many people were injured, beaten, maimed? How many people lost their lives or their livelihood in that coup? Elon Musk thought that was funny as can be. It's his accumulating resources, including lithium that was in Bolivia, in the country to which was couped, and we will be talking about in a few. If that is, then what is he talking about spreading the light of consciousness, and how is it positive for Bolivia with him engaging in that? That's what I want to know.
Okay, so I want to get in a couple more headlines here because this next one is big. We did not get to it in the last couple of batches of headlines. Good conversation, though. Top advisor to Donald Trump, Jason Miller, said on Sunday that the former president will be back online in 2 to 3 months and will launch a new platform that he claimed would attract tens of millions of users. Miller wouldn't go into detail about the new platform, but said the former president has been holding, quote, a lot of high-powered meetings, end quote, at his Mar-a-Lago, Florida resort, and numerous companies are interested in helping to get it off the ground. Twitter permanently kicked Trump off of his platform following the January 6th attack on the Capitol, claiming he was inciting violence and cutting him off from his 88.6 million followers at the time. It was the CEO of MyPillow, Mike Lindell, who announced that he was creating his own social media platform, and I kind of dismissed that at the time, and I still do. It's silly, the nature of social media platforms is you want network effects. You want a lot of people on the same network to build the value of the network, because the more people that are on it, the more people you can get in touch with when you join it, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, it's just interesting to see, in the same way that you have like media nationalism, where different countries are siloing up their independent media spheres. You see the same thing with all the various digital firewalls that are going on, where, again, more signs that more countries than ever are going to set up some form of informational nationalism or digital nationalism, something like that. Same thing is true, but on a smaller scale here. You're probably going to see quite a few. You already do to some extent with Parler versus Twitter, that whole thing. Quite a few competing social networks, which is maybe healthy. I don't know. What's your take, Jamarl? We got to close this out here, bro.
I don't know. That's interesting. See, anything that Donald Trump creates is going to be very specific. Like, you're not going to have a bunch of people propagate to it because it's Donald Trump's. You may have a lot of right-wingers that propagate to it because it's Donald Trump's. I have a hard time seeing how that lives. I agree with you. I mean, usually those social media networks need a large number of people to be able to aggregate to it. And you need interlinking social networks on some level. If it gets to the point where people are only in their own enclaves, I don't think that's a positive experience at all. I just don't. So I agree with you on this one, Shane. I think they do need more people for that to be successful. So I'll close out the headlines. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with a really good conversation again about media in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send him a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We've been having this conversation about the way that U.S. media regards various things that take place. And even though it goes with this idea that it's independent and it's not necessarily state media, it's amazing within the bounds of conversation that are allowed, or the diminutive bounds of conversation that are allowed, and the framing that takes place within the context of those bounds, especially when analyzing, criticizing, or reviewing something that goes outside of their conversation. To have a conversation about that, we're joined with Morgan Atquinina, writer, who writes for Sputnik News and has bylines in Monthly Review, Mint Press News, and Global Times. You can follow Morgan on Twitter at Lavender in Red. Morgan, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate you getting this on short notice. I think I contacted you either on Saturday or Sunday and asked you to come on, so definitely appreciate the short notice contact. You had an event on, I believe it was Sunday at 7 p.m., and it was dealing with the way that media frames and regards various information, especially within the context or outside the context to which they typically like to discuss. I'm going to let you bring us in on that. Could you explain what that event was and what you were trying to get at in that event, meaning what you were trying to get across in that event on the way the media regards information?
Okay, yeah. It was basically kind of a crash course in critical media reading. And we used as our basis an article by Michael Parenti, who is an academic who's written all about history and stuff, and as well as a great deal about media manipulation. And in this article, he kind of goes through some of the common tips and tricks that the corporate media uses to frame stories to get across their specific, narrative. So some of these examples are like suppression by omission, labeling, preemptive assumption, false balancing, follow-up avoidance, pretending that stuff just happens without really explaining the cause, things like that. So the purpose of this event, which was held online, of course, was to we took a New York Times article, and we used the New York Times article that was about reporting on the airstrikes in Syria a couple of weeks ago, and kind of went through it with a fine-tooth comb, looking for examples of these different types of manipulation, of the ways that things were labeled to denigrate them or to shape the way that readers would understand this, to come out on the other side of having read the article with the view of this issue that, the corporate media and the national security state that they operate very closely with want the average American reader or international reader even to have of this issue.
Give us an example.
That sounds like a
great
event. I mean, no, thank you. No, I have a brief problem with my mic there, but Morgan, thank you again for being with us. That sounds like a great overview of a really interesting topic, and one that we address in a sort of more general and summary form on the show on a pretty regular basis. If you had to work, if a friend of yours came to you, and this is admittedly a strange situation, but I could see it potentially happening. A friend of yours comes to you and they ask you, okay, I know there's stuff that I'm missing here. I know that what I read and what I see on TV, what I see online isn't actually representative. There are facts in there, but it is not factual in a deeper sense. It doesn't provide me the context I wish I had, that kind of thing. And if you were trying to help them figure out, okay, what am I missing? Even if it's in a general form, not going story by story, because obviously that would take all of time at this point. But if you had to give them general advice for the audience, for those listening to the show, what advice would you give them on how to disambiguate between the true and the incomplete, between what they see in the news media and what's actually happening? What advice would you give them, Morgan?
I think in that kind of case, at least the tactic that I use is that quantity is its own form of quality. I try to read from both sides. New York Times, what the perspective of the New York Times is. If they're writing a story about Iran, what is the Iranian side saying? What is the airstrikes happened in Syria? What is the Syrian side saying? What are the Iraqis saying? What is the other side of that story? And then even then, what are other political tendencies seeing it? How does like Fox News see it, for example? Or, various, you kind of have to look at it from different perspectives to try and triangulate, basically what happened. You become, in a sense, almost a kind of amateur historian, because as historians operate, and I know because I was trained as a historian, that's kind of what you have to do. You have to look at all of these different sources and kind of figure out where do their different versions of the truth overlap and try to figure that out. It's really helpful also to go to primary sources if possible, so that you get the least amount of distortion from the media.
I think the problem is that most people, when they get up in the morning, they go to work, they come back home, they might decompress, and by the time they decompress, they're not necessarily politicons. They're not necessarily in the weeds of the story. Oftentimes they see a headline, they may see a little blurb here or there, and that's kind of their framing of the world for that. I think that's the issue. It's like, how do you confront that? Because in the way that Shane framed the question, most people aren't necessarily going to dig through the newspaper and kind of point out, okay, this, and this. They're kind of functioning from a prevailing perspective of the whole thing. What's the snapshot? How do you, maybe the question, or maybe the way I'm asking this question is impossible. It's kind of like, how do you get the 100-pound man to lift a car? The strongest man in the world is not going to be 100 pounds. Like, unless there's another way of short-circuiting that process where it doesn't necessarily require the entire, like, historian-type, let's say, background. Or are we stuck with what we got?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there is a little bit of deviousness in that too, right? Is that like you want people to kind of, ideally, in an ideal world, we would have news that was, responsible, multi-sided, tried to be as objective as possible. But like as much as they claim that that's what their goal is, we know from analyzing it that that is not the case. But I mean, and I guess I would think of it as like corporate media is kind of like the fast food of news. You know what I mean? Like fast food could be nutritious, it could be good for you, but in reality, it's just kind of the slop that gets you through the day. I think that corporate media kind of functions in the same way. Like it could be good for you, it could give you an educated version of the world, but if you want to counteract that, the slop they serve you, it's the difference between fast food and fixing yourself, a home cooked meal or something. It takes time, it takes an investment of energy that maybe people who work 40, 50 hours a week have to commute, whatever, don't have time to do that. I think the media is much in the same way. So it is very unfair, and I think that is probably by design as well. As far as how to counteract that, I guess, I mean, not all news outlets are created equal, and I'm a little biased, but I think that at Sputnik News, we do a pretty good job of showing both sides of a story. So especially the side that is, of course, not being told. But I might be biased, so read people other than Sputnik too. But this isn't supposed to be a Sputnik plug, but it is. I mean, that's really kind of it. Is there has to be a certain amount of I guess you could say it's the responsibility of a democratic populace to be educated or whatever. And the real problem is that the media isn't living up to its purpose of keeping people educated. They want to educate people on their specific version of the truth and facts, and that's it.
Well, we're in a weird situation culturally because in at least the last half decade, but it stretches back quite a bit further. I mean, Trump sort of degraded the idea by making the term fake news a sort of euphemism for his whatever is the opposite of his news. And of course, he lied plenty of times. But here's where I would go with this. Culturally, a lot of people do distrust the news media, but there's no sort of baseline of confidence or standard that they can refer back to say, okay, this news is fake and this news is not fake. This news is less accurate or intentionally biased and deceptive, and this news is more accurate. And some people think they have found some frankly good alternative, and hopefully quite a few of them have, but my guess is a lot of the sources that they're choosing to refer to are at least as biased as the ones that they were trying to escape from. And to be frank, I think most people don't know where to look. I think most people do see that there's a problem in the news media. They do see that there's a problem in their entire conception of the world. They know that on the deepest level, something is rotten in Denmark. But for a lot of people, there's no way to resolve that crisis. And so there's a weird suspension of belief that I think goes on that's pervasive in our society and that we're still trying to contend with. And yet at the same time, there are plenty of true believers, I'm sure, whether you're a journalist or an editor or whether you just watch NBC or Fox all the time. I'm sure there are plenty of folks, who don't fall into that category. If we're going to resolve that sort of underlying tension or conflict in some way, if you had to look out in the next 10, 20, 30 years on, the generational level, is there any way that you see things getting better? If so, what does that look like? Morgan?
I mean, I think that the dawn of the internet really as the social phenomenon has become in the last 30 years or so has really kind of helped to shift that. Before the 90s, there really was almost an absolute monopoly on the view, outside of your everyday life, the world outside your everyday life through a handful of news sites, of news channels or whatever. But now you can go on Twitter, you can follow reporters, you can follow leaders of social movements, you can follow people all over the world and kind of get it directly from the source in a way that you couldn't before. And I think that's a really powerful tool for democratizing control over information. But I also think that that's why the national security state and why the tech giants have really kind of are so afraid of that type of democratization. And that's why you see things like the algorithms and the purposeful deranking and, Google's blacklists and stuff like that really kind of tries to get a handle on this free exchange of information that has suddenly become available to people. So I think that if we want to push the consumption of news and information about the world in a more egalitarian, more free, more democratic direction, it really involves defending the right of people to get access to whatever they, to other perspectives on the internet, and for people to be able to have access to those things. So I think that's,
Morgan,
yes.
We're about out of time, and I wanted to give one last chance. Thank you so much for joining us. Great conversation. Wish we'd had you on sooner, and hopefully we can get you back on soon again too. Again, great talking with you. The event that you did on Sunday night, is there any kind of follow-up? Is that part of a series that people might want to learn more about, or was that a one-off?
As far as the media manipulation, we might do something else like it, but it was hosted by the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which puts on these kind of regular forums about education, about whatever. The next one coming up this weekend is about fighting back against anti-Asian hatred, as well as U.S. imperialism against China, which are very intimately linked. So it's kind of a series of online education, popular education programs like that.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that info. For those listening, that was the voice of Morgan Archikina, who writes for Sputnik News and has bylines in Monthly Review, Mint Press News, and Global Times. You can follow Morgan on Twitter at Lavender and Red. And Morgan, thank you again for joining us. We've got to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break with Camila Escalante, talking about Western media's take on Bolivia. My take, it's bonkers, but we'll be back on that topic on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We have the benefit of being perched at the edge of the world and paying attention, and we are not necessarily held to the way that mainstream media views the world. In fact, we are greatly critical of it. In 2019, when Evo Morales was deposed in Bolivia, you had army generals appearing on television basically demanding the resignation and arrests. And this is despite the fact that Evo Morales has just won the election by over 10 points. The Organization of American States comes out and calls the election dodgy despite the fact not having anything to back that up. The OAS has been a tool of U.S. interests for God knows how long. And they've done maybe not exactly this before, but they've been involved in these other type of, let's say, instigations of U.S. interests in other areas of South America. The U.S. media co-signs this. This is fair. I'm just going to read it. They said, quote, "No establishment outlet framed the action as a coup. Instead, President Evo Morales resigned, ABC News, amid widespread protests, CBS News, from an infuriated population, New York Times, angry at the election fraud of a full-blown dictatorship." This is Fox News and Miami Herald. "When the word coup is used at all, it comes only as an accusation from Morales or other officials from the government, which corporate media have been demonizing since the election of 2006. Meaning, they couldn't call a coup, and I suspect a large part of that is because there's a belief that the United States was either involved, and at the very least, definitely backed. Right now, that the MAS Movement Against Socialism government is back in play. People who were involved in the violence of the coup, people who were involved in the killings, the beatings, are now being arrested. And the U.S. media, who could not call a coup, are now bothered by it and believe that this is authoritarianism. This is phenomenal. To join us, to give us some level of clarity in regards to the reality of this, despite what mainstream media is trying to populate to the public, we have Camila Escalante. She's a TV producer and presenter at Telesur English, who also works for Kashwan News. Camila, thank you for joining us to add some kind of reality to these headlines.
Thank you so much for having me. I know we have a short amount of time, but I hope to clarify some things for you guys.
No, absolutely. So Right here, this is Washington Post. Opinion: the Bolivian government is on a lawless course. Its democracy must be preserved. Wall Street Journal: a democratic breakout in Bolivia. Evo Morales resigns, but he'll use the Cuba Chavez playbook to return. This is astonishing. Please give us some clarity on this. What is the reality of this? Is this really an authoritarian takeover? Or are people who are involved in a violent coup basically being held into account?
The Washington Post and any outlet that's pushing that same narrative has no idea what's going on here in Bolivia on the ground. They've obviously not been here. I guess they don't have a ground source. I guess they don't have people regularly covering the situation. I was here during the coup in November 2019. I was one of the first, if not the first, international English-speaking reporter here. I was there in Sanctity before the massacre, the day of the massacre, and after. I interviewed witnesses. I went to the hospital where people were shot with gunshot wounds and they were bleeding to death, and I interviewed the surgeons, the doctors. I also attended the Sacaba massacre aftermath, where I spoke to residents and people who had their house shot up while people went running for cover when the massacre was taking place in Sacaba, in another department, in another part of Bolivia. I know exactly what's going on here. What they've been saying has been completely false. The reason why the government is implementing justice now is not because they want some sort of revenge. It's not because they hate the opponents and they want to wipe them out. It's quite the opposite. They actually wouldn't have implemented any sort of justice except that people are clamoring and screaming and protesting, including today at 10 a.m., which is in 24 minutes, in all the capitals of all the departments of Bolivia. People are demanding justice now. They're demanding an end to impunity, that these people be tried and charged for all of their crimes. And it's not just sedition. It's not just a coup. It's for the massacres. It's for the crimes committed against humanity, against people. Almost 40 people were killed and countless others were injured by gunshot wound by the military and police. And it's well documented, including by human rights organizations and reporters such as myself who witnessed in person.
And I can hear in your voice that you care a lot about this, as you should, and thank you for doing so. As a journalist, I'm curious. We're just having a conversation about what the media leaves out. We're on the other side of the last break, talking with our past guest, Morgan, about exactly this topic. And we're coming back to it in a specific form now. I want to turn to you. What sources do you trust on this? What outlets would you recommend that people pay attention to? And what are the crucial facts that you think somebody who just reads the New York Times or CNN, reads and watches these outlets, what do you think they would be missing that you think they should hear to understand the truth about what happened in Bolivia? Mila.
Well, for example, I've never been a fan of parachute journalism in Latin America. As someone who constantly reports on the ground in Latin America in a number of countries that I focus on, I think it's very important that we follow sources that are always on the ground and always in touch with the social movements and the main political actors, which are the people representing the people and organizations and fronts representing the working class. And that's something that Telesur in Spanish, my colleagues in La Paz, Freddy Morales and his colleagues have done, as well as Hispan TV. These, of course, are Spanish language outlets, but Hispan TV has had Alejandro Kirk here. We've had Sputnik in terms of a writer, Marco Teruggi. And, same with RT has had a constant presence, but we have to be keeping up with the events. We can't just be, just jumping into a situation and calling a government a dictator, which is controlled by the grassroots. Unfortunately and fortunately, this government can't do whatever it wants. People will be very angry if they don't see justice implemented, if they don't see economic stability. People will actually the very people who put them in power will try to take away their power and revert that, and they won't support them in the next election if they don't follow through with their promises. So this is very much a government that is controlled by the indigenous and campesinos who are protesting today.
And we need to be very clear. A dominant win. Like when Evo Morales won that election, he won by over 10 points. There is nothing even close in American politics to a person that popular in regards to being that dominant in the political space. And yet, the way that they were reporting this was as if, hey, he just left, or he just decided to step down. No, It was immediate. It was a coup in every real term of the word. Not to mention a coup was followed by massacres. And so it's like, you're right. The public is clamoring for them to basically have some level of response to what happened. And if they didn't, A, you're asking for it to happen again. But B, more importantly, you don't allow the public to actually get some level of justice for the crime that was committed. Is there any concern about U.S. instigating itself into Bolivian affairs again, just like it did prior with the OAS?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're doing that by way of the OAS. And obviously, they'll eventually, as things escalate, because this is going to take place over the next couple of years, it's going to unfold. We might not see, we're warning of attempts at another coup here in Bolivia, and that, the right-wing media, along with the far right, is working together to put out information which is contrary to what the reality is here. But the State Department will pace itself, and the actual coup attempt might come in a year. It might not be right now, and they have a long ways to go. Of course, Arce just entered the presidency, but they're going to insert themselves once again through through funneling money to the ground actors. In this case, it might continue to be these organizations, NGOs that are camouflaged or in costume of environmentalists, feminists, anything like that. And of course, they're trying to say that these very small minority groups, tiny groups, are more important, and their views are more important than the masses who supported the mass. This is not, the amount of people who support the government is not who supported them in the first round. That was a first round vote. If we had gone to a second round, the mass could have won by 70%. We don't know what the outcome would have been. Of course, there were several presidential candidates there, but at the end of the day, the Washington Post article said that there were tens of thousands of people who took to the streets demanding the ouster of Evo Morales. They're talking about tens of thousands throughout an entire country of millions of people. Right now, today, we're talking about millions of people going to the street in the capitals of each department, demanding justice and support for the president, Luis Arce. That's all in one day. This is much larger, and we're going to see demonstration after mobilization on that same theme until justice is executed. And so I don't understand how they believe that one mass gathering in La Paz and another mass gathering in Santa Cruz by some far-right people who, of course, only live in these main cities. They don't live in any of the rural areas. This is largely a country where people still live in rural areas. They completely erase the vast majority of people living in the vast majority of the country and elevate the voices of the far right.
Let me ask you this. I always make this argument that there is no such thing as international law. And the reason I make this argument is because, to me, none of the stuff is real in real terms. What's real is action and consequences. And basically, the way the people take these political machinations to accomplish things that they want. Washington Post, New York Times, the journalists or the articles that are here in the United States that are looking at those, the countries in South America, it's an issue of resources. I honestly believe it's that. Like, be it the lithium, be it, I don't know, whatever particular product that's available, where they can get their hands on, be it bananas or whatever else. It seems that media follows the function of whatever the prevailing wind of the international state is. And in the case of Bolivia, it seems to be going towards a tenor of it's wrong for Bolivia to take actions that are in the best interest of Bolivia, even if that means we need to put pressure on that government or give it a characterization of something that is not entirely true. I have to be honest, this election gave more credence or credibility to Maduro. It just did. I mean, because it's like, for all of the machinations that take place of saying, oh, we got to get rid of Maduro, he's cheating in the election, Juan Guaido, the works. You have the Bolivian election that is a clear coup, and they can't call it a coup. So what does it mean for the other issues that are taking place in South America? How do you see that? And I'm going to end it here. You can frame it however you want to frame it. But from the standpoint of the way media, go for it.
Well, absolutely. I think, the argument that the right wing, the far right in Venezuela has put forth is that they have claimed that the vast majority of Venezuelans are against the PSUV government of Nicolas Maduro. They say that, whether they say it's 60% of the people are with the opposition or whatever, these are all obviously unfounded, very vague claims. I'm not sure by what means they're gathering that information. But the fact is that in almost all of the elections since the Bolivarian Revolution came to power, the PSUV has won, or the Chavistas, including, the Communist Party and others in the bloc, have continuously won. And the only election in which the opposition was able to win was the 2015 National Assembly election. That's just one election. That's not the governor's races, which we had at the end of 2017. That's not the presidential races. That's literally just one single election. And so if it's the case that they have the vast majority of support, why hasn't one opposition party or candidate or figure emerged to pull together that support and lead, like they say, democratic transition through the ballot box? They haven't done that because they haven't actually had that level of support in which they thought they could actually go to the ballot box and try to win. It's obvious that they had like 3 sucker candidates in the 2018 presidential election, which didn't have a chance of winning, which do have their own following and which are legitimate opposition parties and candidates. But so they don't have that level of support. It's even more pronounced in Nicaragua that the opposition has no level of support in which it could legitimately compete in a democratic election against the Sandinista government of Daniel Ortega. And so, these claims that the vast majority of people oppose the government, they've yet to be seen. They're literally just claims on the internet pushed by far-right, massive media personalities with 1 million figures and who own the means of communication. At the end of the day, we're talking about far-right outlets which exist here in Bolivia and in Venezuela and in other countries, where they have massive platforms online, on television, owning multiple airwaves, and they're the ones putting out this fake news or this distorted news about the reality of the situation in their country, and they're doing it for the international, for the world. It's not just internally to brainwash their own citizens. And that's why it's so important to counter this information. That's, of course, why we founded Cowsashua News, because what was being represented in the English language media abroad had no basis in what was going on here in Bolivia on the ground.
Yeah, it's very bizarre. It's very, very bizarre. When the coup took place and I saw the way that our media was covering it, it was like, whoa, these guys are in a different reality. Like, it was very, very strange. Camilla, I want to thank you. And not just for coming on. You were one of the voices in the beginning when all of this stuff was taking place that gave context to what was going on. And so, really, your passion and everything else for your and drive for the journalistic integrity mattered greatly. So thank you very much. The voice that you guys are listening to, or were listening to, is Camilla Escalante. She's a TV producer and presenter at Telesur English, who also works with Cashwan News. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with the wrap.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. It is the wrap segment for today's show. It's the last segment of the show today. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, that is 202-521-1320. Feel free to call in. We're here. Great show today so far, I thought, Jamarl. And I say so far, we're at the end of it. So unless something goes terribly wrong, just
it can go terribly wrong in the last 15. Yeah. Totally.
No, but good combos today. I will notice this. In the last hour and a half of today's show, every one of our guests, and this includes Vijay Prashad, the first half of his we were talking about the Iraq War throughout the whole thing and a bit about Syria. For the first half, we were talking about what happened, his coverage of it, all this stuff, international law, interesting conversation. And the second half, and in every interview that followed that, we've been talking about media malfeasance and the news media in the West specifically getting it wrong, having a biased take, pretending they're objective, pretending they're unbiased, all that stuff. That's what they do. Nevertheless, not actually doing that, being about as biased as you can be. Just an interesting note. That seems if today's show had a theme, I would argue that was the theme of today's show. And our producer, Mary T, I will also note on Twitter that the photo that she chose to represent today's show also fit that theme. So good job, Mary T. That was on point. Anyway, good
right
conversation
on.
and worth having, frankly. And we're not just trying to push ourselves up a little bit by saying, hey, we're better. We try to be, but no, those are the real problems. And fundamentally, like if journalism is the platform by which people are educated, not just in childhood, not just in adolescence and in their early 20s, but throughout their life about what's going on, actually, what is happening in the world. And if there is systemic bias there, if there's constant and growing corruption of that industry, of that institution, then that's in some sense, it's like the deepest problem that you can have, one of the deepest problems that you can have. And we do try to fix it here, but it's worth it addressing regardless. Anyway.
1000% agree. I mean, it is. From the time that you're born to the time that you drop dead, what is the thing that gives you your perspective of the world? And you can say, yes, it's your parents on some level. Yes, it's your governments on some level. But at the end of the day, your media is the thing that's kind of creating that framing for you. It's supposed to be the independent actor, at least in the United States, that says this is true, this is false, called balls and strikes. But what does your world look like when the thing that is supposed to call balls and strikes get it wrong? And not just get it wrong, seemingly gets it wrong on purpose and badly wrong. Like the Bolivia stuff, the military tells the guy to get lost. The military is about to arrest the leader, the president of the country. And even if you want to make this warped case that the guy either didn't win or something else was nefarious with the results, he called for a re-election. That didn't matter. They didn't want a re-election because they had already lost by 10 points. The OAS had nothing for this. You must also understand that the OAS is largely funded or pushed by the United States. And the OAS has shown itself to be a biased actor before. So this is not even the first time that they've involved themselves into something that basically allowed, let's say, an instigation of a coup or some other kind of malfeasance. In this very specific instance, though, what was clearly a coup by all measure and all metrics of the term, we, in our media, call something else. Those are moments where you can look at it and say, okay, by my definition and by, reality itself, this is a coup, and they don't call it that. Why not? That's the question. Why not? Because why not is the thing that gets you to some level of understanding of what's wrong. There's something wrong with this picture. And honestly, if these are the guys who are basically saying when the president is being escorted and threatened by the military and people are being beaten up and killed in the streets, that somehow is not indicative of a coup. That's indicative of a normal transition of power. They are warped. They are massively warped. And like I said, Shane, like the biting questions, for whatever reason, they don't seem to ask. I've watched the White House press thing. I've watched the State Department thing. And it seems like in one situation after the next, they avoid the questions. It's very strange. Like I said, how does Biden get into office, kill 22 people in a foreign country, and they say, they never ask him, aren't you a killer also? Like that just seems to be the most operative question in the world to ask the president. In fact, it seems like you should be eager to ask that question to Jen Psaki. He's like, oh, I'm going to get her on this one. What is she going to say? They can't bring themselves to do it. Which brings up various questions about, is this really an adversarial media? It's not. It's not.
No, it's not. And here's, what would happen? What would happen if they did that? And this is the freaking trap that we built for ourselves. And I say we, but it's really the U.S. state itself and certain intellectuals and writers. If they ask questions that are contrary to the United States' interest in foreign policy, you know what they'll be labeled as? They'll be labeled as influenced by the Russians or influenced by the Chinese or controlled by some socialist government. Any pushback, and you can see this happening because you have seen it happening, any serious pushback from journalists on U.S. foreign policy, and increasingly, I would argue, on domestic policy, is going to be portrayed as foreign interference, which is effing ridiculous. Because where's the wiggle room? In a weird way, they bought into this idea that everybody has to be controlled by somebody. Maybe because they're so used to controlling people. But like, you could bring critical theory into this, and I don't want to, some people would be screaming to high heaven that I'm abusing the term. But the idea that every perspective is constrained by biases and interests, I don't want to get into a philosophical conversation here, but you can have more objective approaches and less objective approaches. You can have, I would argue that just if you're pushing back on what the United States is doing, that doesn't mean, in fact, in the vast majority of cases, that specifically does not mean that you've been co-opted by some outside interest. And to reduce it to co-optation on either side is to say that in some sense you can't have objective journalism. And I don't think that's true. I think you can have more objective journalism. We've got callers and we're taking more.
That's interesting.
202-521-1320.
Yeah, just real quick. I do think there's a difference between things that are closer to reality than not. Meaning, I think you can have something that's more objective than others. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I agree.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Great. All right, let's go to Travis calling in from Arizona. Travis, you are on the line. What is on your mind?
Good morning. I do appreciate your guys' segment on news coverage and some of the deficiencies with mainstream news. What I wanted to say is that over the last long time now, I've noticed that people increasingly kind of don't want to be informed. They're very comfortable accepting a mainstream narrative that's put in place by the U.S. government because it's just easy to do that. It's just it's accessible. They're going to hear it wherever they turn the TV on. It's going to be reinforced, and they accept it. And I've tried to kind of politicize people and say, hey, we can't tune out. We have to be just as vigilant after Trump than we were before him, and even during Obama age. We have to be vigilant in understanding what happened and why it happened. And I just find that people are kind of increasingly illiterate. Like no one really reads anymore because you have to have historical context to attach these events to, and people seem to have no historical context. And so,
Travis, is it that, or is it that people spend most of their time working? Like if you spend 8-9 hours of your day.
It could be both.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's one or the other. I guess I'm thinking, is it that people don't, meaning if everything that you're exposed to is mainstream media, it's accessible, right? Even when you're pumping your gas in a car, there's a little window there, and it's somebody on media telling you something that you're supposed to believe. And everywhere you go, it's that. The people you talk to around you, it's that. Meaning it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And so it's like you have two strands of a point of view, MSNBC, Fox News. These two strands are supposedly unattached to the government, despite the fact that the parties and their propaganda outlets for the parties that are in government. And that's what you basically have as a balance of conversation in America for the overwhelming majority of the time. How do you escape that? And are they wrong for not escaping that if they don't even see that there's an escape?
I think they are wrong for not making the effort to escape it. I mean, the only way you can sustain a democracy, a viable democracy, is to inform populace. And if the populace isn't informed, then you have to wonder, do they in fact want a democracy? Do they actually want choice? And so I think, the fact that people work more than ever before in this country, I think that is material. I think it factors. However, I mean, I just know people who haven't read a book since high school or something. I mean, people just don't want to make the effort. It's like maintaining a democracy takes a lot of effort, and I don't think people really want to exert that time.
It is true. You know what? I've got to say, Travis, I agree with you. I was going to come back with a question. We don't have that much time, and I don't even know exactly how much it applies. But people were willing to. I know people who do. I know plenty of people who read books. I know plenty of people who watch the media. But there seemed to be some acceleration of their attention to the media during Trump's presidency. There was a political motivation for them to get into it, which means there are some things that can push people out of whatever shells they built for themselves. People can get more engaged. And I'm not saying that the way a lot of folks got engaged during Trump's presidency, I was exactly in favor of, but hey, I guess my point is, one, people can exert the effort if there's some incentive to get them to do so. And for a couple of years, we did see that incentive. We don't have enough time to go back to. I'm sorry, we got to close out today's show. But I really do wonder, is there something that we can do to get people engaged again, to get people interested in it, to give people that incentive? In the same way that there is a political fury over Trump, is there something that we can do to create a political fury and a political dedication over all the transgressions of moral law and all of the terrible things we've done? I think there is, and I think we're going to find it on this show. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to all of our guests. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. We got video going now. I'm live on his feed. Thank you, producer Mary T. Thank you, engineer Andre, and thank you for listening. Have a great day, folks. We'll be back tomorrow, signing off Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Badass. Shane is right. We have video now. We're about to take over the world. We're going to find it all on Fault Lines. Look, guys, I want to thank all of you. Badass show. VJ Prasad, man. VJ Prasad. Hands off to him. He's awesome. I said something wrong and he hit me on it. He nailed me on it. Basically, when I asked him whether or not, I think I said they killed the wrong people or something like that. And I was trying to make the point that from their perspective, from their context, they're trying to off various people. And from their perspective, they got it wrong. And yeah, there's something to be said. Do people have a right to defend themselves? And the answer, of course, was yes. And if you're in a foreign country and another country invades that country, do people there have a right to defend themselves? Yes. Iraq is not on the border of Oklahoma, and it was a war of aggression. So 18 years ago today, we're still in those countries. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. I want to thank you all. Talk to you tomorrow or later today. Thanks all.